Hello everyone, and welcome back to Mr. Sleepy Crime. I know many of you enjoy listening to these stories as you fall asleep. So before you drift off, I'd love for you to leave a comment letting me know where in the world you're tuning in from. And if you're enjoying the story, don't forget to like and subscribe. It really helps the channel grow. Before we begin, I want to acknowledge that this story involves real people and real tragedies. We tell these stories not for entertainment, but to remember the victims and perhaps help others recognize the warning signs that could prevent similar tragedies. For the best experience, feel free to lower the volume a little, just enough to let the story gently carry you off to sleep. Alright, please get comfortable, dim the lights, and let's dive into tonight's first story. Tonight we're going to explore a case that captured the attention of millions around the world. A story that began on a quiet autumn day in rural Wisconsin, and ended in a tragedy that would raise questions about justice, truth, and the nature of innocence itself. This is the story of Teresa Halbach. So as you settle into your blankets, let yourself relax. This story unfolds slowly, methodically, the way these things often do in real life. There's no rush. Just listen, and let the details wash over you. Teresa Marie Halbach was born on March 22, 1980, in the small town of Kaukauna, Wisconsin. She grew up in the kind of place where everyone knows everyone, where dairy farms stretch across rolling hills, and the smell of freshly cut hay fills the summer air. Her family's farm had been established by her great-grandfather, a German immigrant who built something lasting from nothing but hard work and determination. Teresa was one of 5 children, 2 brothers, Timothy and Michael, and 2 sisters, Kelly and Katie. The Halbach household was warm, bustling, full of life. On the farm, everyone had their role, while her father and brothers tended to the herd of more than 60 cows. Teresa would often babysit her younger sisters, creating a bond that would last throughout her life. She was the kind of person people remembered, not because she sought attention, but because of the energy she brought into every room. Her friends would later describe her as having an infectious smile, the kind that made you want to smile back, even if you didn't know why. She had short, sporty brown hair that she tucked behind her ears, expressive brown eyes, and a personality that seemed to radiate warmth. In high school at Hilbert, a small country school with fewer than 200 students, Teresa wasn't content to simply blend in. She had leading roles in school productions of Hello Dolly, The Music Man, and Anything Goes. She ran cross-country track, her feet pounding against the rural roads she'd known all her life. She was, in every sense, engaged with the world around her. But it was photography that truly captured her heart. When Teresa graduated from Hilbert High School in 1998, she knew exactly what she wanted to do. She enrolled at the University of Wisconsin-Green Bay, pursuing a degree in photography. She threw herself into her studies with the same enthusiasm she'd brought to everything else. She worked at the college newspaper, learning her craft, developing her eye. She traveled to Spain, to Mexico, to New Zealand, and Australia, where she learned to scuba dive in waters far from the dairy farms of home. In 2002, Teresa graduated summa cum laude. At 22 years old, she had her whole life ahead of her, and she was ready to build something of her own. She took a job at a photography studio in Green Bay, specializing in family portraits and children's photography. She was good at it, really good. She had a gift for making people feel comfortable in front of the camera, for capturing natural smiles rather than stiff posed expressions. Parents would specifically request her for their children's portraits. She'd joke with them, make them laugh, and in that moment of genuine joy, she'd snap the perfect shot. But Teresa had bigger dreams. She wanted her own studio, her own business. In 2005, she took the leap. She opened Photography by Teresa, a small operation, but it was hers. To supplement her income while building her client base, she took freelance assignments for Auto Trader magazine, photographing used vehicles that people wanted to advertise for sale. It wasn't glamorous work, but it paid the bills. And Teresa approached it with the same professionalism she brought to everything else. She'd drive around the region, meeting with sellers, snapping photos of cars, trucks, minivans, whatever needed to be in the magazine. She kept CDs in her car and loved to sing along as she drove. Her favorite song was Picture by Sheryl Crow and Kid Rock. She considered it the theme song for her career, somehow. By October of 2005, Teresa was 25 years old. She lived in a small house she rented on her parents' property in St. John, sharing it with a friend. She coached her younger sister's 7th grade volleyball team at St. John's Sacred Heart School. She loved karaoke, loved spending time with her family and friends. She had, according to everyone who knew her, a zest for life. She talked often about wanting to be a mother someday. When people would joke that working with children all day must be exhausting, must make her think twice about having kids of her own, she'd shake her head. "It's just the opposite for me," she'd say. Now Halloween was coming. October 31st, 2005. Teresa had a few photography assignments scheduled for that Monday. Just routine work, the kind she'd done dozens of times before. She planned to finish up, then meet her family at a local bar for a Halloween party that evening. She never made it to that party. Monday, October 31st, 2005, dawned crisp and cool in Wisconsin. Autumn was settling in, the leaves turning gold and crimson, the air carrying that distinctive chill that promises winter isn't far behind. For Teresa Halbach, it was just another workday. She had her blue 1999 Toyota RAV4, her camera equipment, her list of appointments. She left her home in Hilbert that morning, heading out on Route 10, probably with her radio on, probably singing along like she always did. She had 3 appointments scheduled, 3 different locations where people wanted to sell vehicles through Auto Trader magazine. The last appointment of the day was at a place called Avery's Auto Salvage. The Avery property was a sprawling 40-acre salvage yard near the town of Two Rivers, right near Lake Michigan, about 35 miles from Teresa's home. It was the kind of place that had been in the family for generations. Acres and acres of old cars, trucks, parts, equipment, all scattered across the property in a seemingly random pattern that somehow made sense to the people who worked there. Stephen Avery lived on the property in a small trailer. He was 43 years old that fall, and he had a complicated history with the justice system, one that would later become central to understanding everything that followed. Teresa had been to Avery's Auto Salvage before. In fact, she'd been there at least 15 times over the previous months, taking photographs of various vehicles the Averys wanted to advertise. It was routine work. She'd show up, spend maybe 15 or 20 minutes taking pictures, then move on to her next appointment. But this time, something was different. According to phone records later examined by investigators, Stephen Avery had called Teresa 3 times on October 31st. Twice he'd used a feature to block his number. The prosecution would later argue this showed premeditation, that Avery didn't want Teresa to know it was him calling. The defense would counter that it was innocent, that Avery simply wanted to ensure the appointment was still on. What we know for certain is this. Teresa arrived at Avery's Auto Salvage that afternoon. The vehicle she was supposed to photograph was a maroon Plymouth Voyager minivan. She took her pictures, and then she vanished. Teresa had other appointments scheduled for that day, other places to be, but she never showed up. She didn't call. She didn't answer her phone. For a young woman who was reliable, who was professional, who stayed in close contact with her family and friends, this silence was immediately alarming. When Teresa didn't come home that night, didn't show up at the Halloween party, her family knew something was wrong. Her mother, Karen, tried calling her repeatedly. The phone went to voicemail. She tried again and again. Nothing. By November 3rd, 2 days after Halloween, Karen Halbach couldn't wait any longer. She contacted the police and reported her daughter missing. The last place Teresa had been seen was Avery's Auto Salvage. That's where the investigation would begin. When Teresa Halbach was reported missing on November 3rd, the law enforcement began the methodical process of trying to retrace her steps. They spoke with her family, her friends, her co-workers at Auto Trader. They obtained her phone records, her schedule for that day. Every lead pointed to the same conclusion. Stephen Avery's salvage yard was the last place anyone knew for certain Teresa had been. On November 3rd, officers from the Manitoba County Sheriff's Department drove out to Avery's Auto Salvage. It's important to understand the context here, because it would become crucial to everything that followed. Stephen Avery had a history with Manias, Dassey with Maniatorats, county law enforcement, but not the kind you might think. In 1985, Avery had been convicted of sexual assault and attempted murder of a woman named Penny Berenson. He'd been sentenced to 32 years in prison for a crime he insisted, from the very beginning, he did not commit. For 18 years, Avery maintained his innocence. For 18 years, no one believed him, until 2003, when the Wisconsin Innocence Project took on his case. They had the DNA evidence from the Berenson attack, retested using more modern technology. The results were unequivocal. Stephen Avery was not the perpetrator. The DNA matched another man entirely. Gregory Allen, a convicted sex offender who looked remarkably similar to Avery. Allen was already serving a 60-year sentence for another rape he'd committed. 10 years after the Berenson attack, Stephen Avery was released from prison in 2003, after serving 18 years for a crime he did not commit. He was exonerated, freed, but he was also angry, understandably so. Those were 18 years he'd never get back. 18 years of his life, taken. So Avery did what anyone might do in his position. He sued. He filed a $36 million lawsuit against Manitowoc County, against the sheriff, against the district attorney, everyone involved in his wrongful conviction. The lawsuit was pending, working its way through the courts, when Teresa Halbach disappeared. This context matters, because it would later fuel endless speculation. Did Manitowoc County have a motive to frame Stephen Avery, to plant evidence, to ensure he went back to prison, this time permanently, so he couldn't cost them millions of dollars? But we're getting ahead of ourselves. On November 3rd, when officers first arrived at the salvage yard, they were simply looking for information about a missing woman. They spoke with Stephen Avery. He was cooperative, calm. Yes, he said. Teresa Halbach had been there on Monday afternoon. She'd taken pictures of the minivan, same as always. Then she'd left in her Rabbi 4, around 4:30 in the afternoon. He had no idea where she'd gone after that. The officers looked around the property, but 40 acres is a lot of ground to cover, especially when it's filled with hundreds of vehicles and piles of auto parts. They found nothing that day, but they'd be back. On November 5th, 2 days after Teresa was reported missing, a volunteer search party was organized. More than 120 people showed up. Friends, family, concerned citizens, all wanting to help find Teresa. They were given maps of the area, divided into teams and sent out to search. One of those volunteers was a man named Earl Sturm. He was searching through the Avery salvage yard when something caught his eye. A vehicle partially hidden beneath branches and debris at the back of the property. He moved closer. It was a blue Toyota RAV4. Finding the vehicle changed everything. This was no longer just a missing person case. This was now almost certainly a homicide investigation. Because if Teresa's car was on the Avery property, but Teresa herself was nowhere to be found, the implications were grim. The police obtained a search warrant and descended on the salvage yard. They would search that property for days, combing through every inch, documenting everything they found. And what they found would form the backbone of the prosecution's case against Stephen Avery. Inside Teresa's RAV4, investigators discovered bloodstains. The blood was tested. It matched Stephen Avery's DNA. Not just similar, an exact match. There was also DNA evidence suggesting Teresa had been in the vehicle, which wasn't surprising since it was her car. But the presence of Avery's blood was damning. The defense would later argue that the blood was planted, that it came from a vial of Avery's blood that had been stored from his earlier wrongful conviction case. The prosecution would counter that this was conspiracy theory nonsense, that there was no evidence of planting. On November 6th, investigators made another discovery. In a burn barrel near Avery's garage, they found remnants of a camera and a cell phone, burned partially melted but still identifiable. These items were consistent with the equipment Teresa was known to carry. Then, on November 8th, behind Stephen Avery's detached garage, investigators examined a fire pit. It was the kind of place you'd burn yard waste, maybe roast marshmallows, on a cool evening. But when they sifted through the ashes, they found something else. Bone fragments, charred, broken pieces of what appeared to be human remains. The bones were sent for analysis. The forensic anthropologist confirmed they were human. More specifically, they were the remains of an adult woman. DNA testing and dental records would later confirm these were the remains of Teresa Halbach. A piece of her tooth was found and matched to her dental x-rays. The medical examiner testified that he found skull fragments with beveled edges consistent with gunshot wounds. Teresa Hellback had been shot. More searches of the property yielded more evidence. A key to Teresa's rabbit chiffre was found in Stephen Avery's bedroom. A bullet fragment was discovered in Avery's garage, and it tested positive for Teresa's DNA. Avery's DNA was found on the hood latch of Teresa's vehicle. On November 9th, 2005, Stephen Avery was arrested. He was charged with being a felon in possession of firearms. 2 rifles had been found in his trailer, and as a convicted felon, even though that conviction had been overturned, he wasn't supposed to have weapons. 6 days later, the bigger charges came. First-degree intentional homicide and mutilation of a corpse. Stephen Avery maintained his innocence. He told anyone who would listen that he was being framed, that Manitowoc County was setting him up to avoid the $36 million lawsuit. But the evidence against him was overwhelming. His blood in her car, her remains in his fire pit, her car key in his bedroom, her DNA on a bullet in his garage. How could anyone argue with physical evidence like that? And then, in March of 2006, the case took another turn. One that would prove even more controversial than anything that had come before. Brendan Dassey was 16 years old in the winter of 2006. He was Stephen Avery's nephew, the son of Avery's sister Barbara. Brendan lived on the Avery property with his mother and brothers in a mobile home, not far from Stephen's trailer. Brendan was by all accounts a quiet kid. He struggled in school. His IQ was measured at around 65, which classified him as borderline intellectually disabled. He received special education services at Mishicot High School. He had trouble with social cues, with understanding facial expressions and body language. He was slow to comprehend, slow to respond. He loved WWE wrestling and video games. He wasn't a troublemaker. Before this case, he'd never had any contact with the criminal justice system. In the initial investigation into Teresa Hellback's disappearance, police had spoken with Brendan briefly on November 6, 2005. He told them he hadn't seen Teresa that day. Didn't know anything about what happened. The interview was short, and investigators moved on to other leads. But in January of 2006, something changed. Brendan's cousin, 15-year-old Kayla Avery, went to speak with a school counselor. She seemed upset, worried about Brendan. She said he was acting weird, not sleeping, losing weight, becoming emotional over small things. She implied that Brendan might know something about what happened to Teresa Hellback. The school counselor contacted authorities. On February 20th, this information was passed along to investigators. On February 27th, 2006, Detectives Mark Wiegert and Tom Fassbender went to Mishicot High School. They pulled Brendan out of class and spoke with him in a private room. This first interview lasted about an hour. Brendan admitted to seeing what he thought might have been a body in a bonfire at Stephen's place on Halloween night, but he insisted he hadn't been involved in anything. After this interview, the detectives contacted prosecutor Ken Kratz. They played him the audio recording. Kratz listened and told them they needed a better record, a clearer confession. So that same day, February 27th, the detectives took Brendan from the school to the Two Rivers police station for another interview. This time, the questioning was more pointed. The detectives used what's known as the Reed technique, a controversial interrogation method that involves assuming the suspect is guilty and using psychological tactics to elicit a confession. They told Brendan repeatedly that they already knew what had happened, that they just needed him to tell the truth, that this was his chance to help himself, to be honest, to get the story off his chest. They assured him he had nothing to worry about. They positioned themselves as being on his side, as wanting to help him. Brendan was questioned for hours over the course of that day, first at the school, then at the police station. No parent was present. No lawyer was there to advise him. It was just Brendan, a 16-year-old boy with borderline intellectual functioning and 2 trained investigators. By the end of that day, Brendan had admitted to seeing Teresa's body in Stephen's garage, but the investigators wanted more. They placed Brendan, his brother, and his mother in protective custody at a local resort that night, saying they were concerned for their safety. The next morning, March 1st, 2006, the detectives came for Brendan again. They picked him up from the resort and took him to the Manitowoc County Sheriff's Department. Brendan's mother, Barbara, asked if she should come along. The investigators said no. That wouldn't be necessary. They read Brendan his Miranda rights. He said he understood. The interview began at 11 in the morning. For the next 3 to 4 hours, the investigators questioned Brendan. The entire session was video recorded. What happened in that room would become one of the most hotly debated aspects of the entire case. During this interrogation, Brendan told a horrific story. He said that when he got off the school bus on Halloween afternoon around 3:45, he went to his uncle Stephen's trailer. He said Stephen had Teresa Halbach tied to the bed. He said he and Stephen sexually assaulted her. He said they stabbed her, strangled her. He said Stephen shot her in the garage. He said they burned her body in the fire pit. The details were graphic, disturbing, seemingly damning, but there were problems with the story, significant problems that would emerge during the trial and in the years to follow. First, many of the details came not from Brendan spontaneously offering information, but from the investigators leading him, prompting him, suggesting answers. When asked how Teresa was killed, Brendan would guess. The investigators would say no. That's not right. Try again. Brendan would guess something else. Eventually, he'd land on an answer that satisfied them. For example, when asked what was done to Teresa's head, Brendan guessed various things. The investigators kept pressing. Finally, one of them asked, "Who shot her in the head?" Only then did Brendan say there was a shooting, but even then he couldn't provide consistent details about where the shooting happened. He said it was outside, then later changed it to the garage when the investigators said that's where they'd found a bullet. Second, absolutely no physical evidence corroborated Brendan's story. He said Teresa had been tied to Stephen's bed, that there had been stabbing and blood everywhere in the bedroom, but despite multiple searches, no blood evidence was found in Stephen's trailer. No DNA from Teresa, no evidence of a violent struggle. The mattress was tested. Nothing. Brendan said Teresa's throat had been cut, that she'd been stabbed, but the medical examiner found no evidence of stabbing in the bone fragments that were recovered. The only definitive cause of death was gunshot wounds to the head. Third, Brendan's demeanor during the confession was troubling. He spoke in short, simple sentences. He frequently said, "I don't know," or "I guess." When the investigators asked leading questions, he often agreed with whatever they suggested. Experts who later analyzed the interrogation noted that Brendan displayed classic signs of someone whose confession was being coerced, not through physical force, but through psychological manipulation. Perhaps most damning for the credibility of the confession. Immediately after the interview ended, Brendan spoke with his mother. The conversation was recorded. Brendan seemed confused about what had just happened. When his mother asked him why he did what he confessed to, he said, "I didn't want to." She asked if Stephen forced him. Brendan shook his head. No. Then Brendan asked his mother a question that suggested he didn't fully understand the consequences of what he'd just confessed to. He asked if he'd get back to school by a certain time, as if he thought he was just going to go back to his normal life after confessing to rape and murder. Defense attorneys and advocates would later argue that Brendan's confession was false, that it was the product of a vulnerable teenager with limited intellectual capacity being manipulated by trained interrogators who fed him details and coached him into confessing to a crime he didn't commit. But the prosecution saw it differently. They argued that Brendan knew things only someone involved in the crime could know, that his confession, while obtained without a lawyer present, was voluntary, that he'd waived his rights knowingly and intelligently. On March 2nd, 2006, prosecutor Ken Kratz held a press conference. He laid out in graphic detail what Brendan Dassey had confessed to: the sexual assault, the torture, the murder. The press conference was broadcast across Wisconsin and picked up by national media. It was inflammatory, emotional, designed to leave no doubt in anyone's mind that Stephen Avery and Brendan Dassey were guilty. Defense attorneys would later argue that this press conference made it virtually impossible for their clients to receive a fair trial. How could a jury be impartial after hearing such horrific allegations repeated as fact in the media? But the damage was done. In the court of public opinion, Stephen Avery and Brendan Dassey were already convicted. The legal proceedings that followed would take months and involve two separate trials. One for Stephen Avery, one for Brendan Dassey. Both trials would grip Wisconsin and eventually the nation. Brendan Dassey's trial came first, in April of 2007. He was tried as an adult, despite being only 16 at the time of the alleged crime. He was charged with first-degree intentional homicide, second-degree sexual assault, and mutilation of a corpse, all as party to a crime. The prosecution's case rested almost entirely on Brendan's confession. There was no physical evidence linking him to the crime. No DNA. No fingerprints. No witnesses who saw him with Teresa. Just his words on that videotaped interrogation from March 1st. The defense argued that the confession was coerced, unreliable, the product of psychological manipulation. They brought in experts on false confessions, on the vulnerability of intellectually disabled juveniles during interrogation. They pointed out the inconsistencies, the lack of corroborating evidence, the leading questions by investigators. But the jury heard the confession. They heard Brendan's voice describing terrible acts. And even though the defense argued it was false, the jury believed it was real. On April 25th, 2007, Brendan Dassey was convicted on all 3 counts. At his sentencing, he was given life in prison with no possibility of parole for 41 years. He would be in his 50s before he could even be considered for release. Stephen Avery's trial began shortly after, in February of 2007. Unlike Brendan's trial, which hinged on a confession, Stephen's trial was all about physical evidence. The prosecution presented a damning case. They showed the jury Teresa's Rabbi 4 with Stephen's blood inside. They presented the key to the Rabbi 4 found in Stephen's bedroom with his DNA on it. They showed the bullet fragment from his garage with Teresa's DNA. They presented the bone fragments from his fire pit. They showed that Stephen had specifically requested Teresa for the auto trader assignment, that he'd called her multiple times that day, that he was the last person known to have seen her alive. The prosecution argued that Stephen lured Teresa to the property, attacked her, killed her in his garage, then burned her body in the fire pit to destroy the evidence. They said he hid her car at the back of the 40-acre property, covered it with branches, disconnected the battery to disable the GPS, and prevent it from being easily found. The defense, led by attorneys Dean Strang and Jerome Budding, argued that Stephen was being framed. They suggested that Manitowoc County law enforcement, angry about the pending $36 million lawsuit, planted evidence to ensure Stephen went back to prison. They pointed out that a Manitowoc deputy found the key to Teresa's car in Stephen's bedroom, but only after multiple searches of that same room had found nothing. They suggested the key was planted. They noted that Stephen's blood in Teresa's RAV4 could have come from a vial of his blood that had been stored from his earlier wrongful conviction case. They showed the jury that the evidence seal on that vial had been broken, suggesting someone had accessed it. They argued that the bone fragments could have been moved to Stephen's fire pit from another location, that they weren't necessarily burned there originally. They suggested alternative suspects who had never been seriously investigated. Teresa's ex-boyfriend, Ryan Hillegas, who had access to her voicemail and had allegedly deleted messages. Other Avery family members who lived on the property and might have had opportunity. But the prosecution had an answer for everything. The broken seal on the blood vial was from the defense team in Stephen's civil suit, not from anyone trying to plant evidence. The bone fragments showed evidence of being burned at very high temperatures, consistent with the fire Stephen admitted having in his pit on Halloween night. The key wasn't planted, it had simply been missed in earlier searches and was found when investigators were more thorough. Most importantly, the defense couldn't explain away all the evidence. Maybe one piece could have been planted. Maybe 2. But all of it, Stephen's blood in the car, Teresa's DNA on the bullet, the bones in his fire pit, the key in his bedroom, his DNA on her car's hood latch, how could all of that be planted without leaving any trace of the planting? On March 18, 2007, after deliberating for several days, the jury reached a verdict. They found Stephen Avery guilty of first-degree intentional homicide and felon in possession of a firearm. Interestingly, they found him not guilty of mutilating a corpse, suggesting they had some doubt about that particular charge. On June 1, 2007, Stephen Avery was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole, plus an additional 10 years for the weapons charge. Both Stephen Avery and Brendan Dassey would spend the next years filing appeals, arguing that they'd been wrongfully convicted. Those appeals would wind through the court system for years. Then in December of 2015, something happened that would thrust this case back into the national spotlight in a way no one could have anticipated. On December 18, 2015, Netflix released a 10-episode documentary series called Making a Murderer. The series, created by filmmakers Laura Riccicciardi and Moira Demos, had been in production for 10 years. It followed Stephen Avery's story from his wrongful conviction in the 80s through his exoneration and then his arrest and trial for Teresa Halbach's murder. The documentary was gripping, controversial, and it became a cultural phenomenon almost overnight. Millions of people watched it. It sparked endless debates online, in offices, at dinner tables across America and around the world. People formed free Stephen Avery groups. They started petitions. They analyzed every frame of the interrogation footage, every piece of evidence shown in the series. But the documentary was also highly controversial for what it didn't show. Critics argued that it was biased, that it presented only the defense's perspective, that it left out crucial evidence that pointed to Avery's guilt. Prosecutor Ken Kratz went on multiple media outlets to argue that the filmmakers had manipulated the story, omitted important facts, essentially created a piece of defense advocacy disguised as objective documentary. The Halbach family declined to participate in the documentary. Teresa's brother, Mike, who had been a spokesperson for the family during the investigation and trials, chose not to be interviewed. In one of the few statements the family made about the series, they expressed frustration that it focused so heavily on the accused and so little on the victim, on Teresa herself, on the life that was taken, on the family's grief. And they had a point. For all the hours of footage, for all the discussion of evidence and legal procedure and potential corruption, Teresa Halbach herself remains somewhat in shadow. We see photos of her smiling face. We hear her friends describe her warmth, her love of life. But the documentary is ultimately about Stephen Avery and the question of whether he was framed, not about who Teresa was as a person. The release of Making a Murderer ignited efforts to overturn the convictions. Stephen Avery hired a new attorney, Kathleen Zellner, who was known for successfully exonerating wrongfully convicted clients. She began investigating the case with new technology, new forensic methods, new experts. For Brendan Dassey, his attorneys from the Center on Wrongful Convictions of Youth continued to fight. And in August of 2016, they achieved something remarkable. A federal magistrate judge, William Duffin, overturned Brendan's conviction. Judge Duffin reviewed the interrogation tapes carefully. He found that the detectives had made false promises to Brendan, telling him he had nothing to worry about, that he just needed to be honest and everything would be okay. He found that these promises, combined with Brendan's age and intellectual limitations and the absence of a parent or attorney, made the confession involuntary and therefore inadmissible. For a brief moment, it looked like Brendan might be released, but the state of Wisconsin appealed the decision. The appeals court stayed Brendan's release while they considered the case. In 2017, a three-judge panel of the Seventh Circuit Court of Appeals ruled 2-1 in Brendan's favor, upholding Judge Duffin's decision. Again, it seemed like Brendan might go free, but the state asked for an en banc hearing, meaning all the judges of the Seventh Circuit would review the case, not just a three-judge panel. In June of 2018, the full court ruled 4-3 against Brendan. The majority found that while the interrogation tactics were troubling, they didn't rise to the level of being unconstitutionally coercive. The confession still. Brendan's attorneys appealed to the U.S. Supreme Court, but in June of 2018, the Supreme Court declined to hear the case. Brendan would remain in prison. For Stephen Avery, the legal battles continue to this day. Kathleen Zellner has filed multiple motions for a new trial, arguing she has new evidence, new witnesses, new scientific testing that proves Stephen's innocence. She's pointed to Bobby Dassey, Brendan's older brother, as an alternative suspect. She's argued that evidence was planted, that the investigation was compromised, that Stephen didn't receive a fair trial. So far, the courts have denied these motions. Stephen remains in prison, maintaining his innocence, insisting that someday the truth will come out. Netflix released a second season of Making a Murderer in October of 2018, following Kathleen Zellner's investigation and the continued legal efforts. It generated renewed interest and debate, but didn't change the fundamental reality. Both Stephen Avery and Brendan Dassey remain incarcerated for the murder of Teresa Halbach. Here we are now, nearly 20 years after Teresa Halbach disappeared on that Halloween afternoon in 2005. And despite 2 trials, multiple appeals, thousands of hours of documentary footage, and millions of words written analyzing every aspect of this case, fundamental questions remain unanswered. If Stephen Avery is guilty, how do we reconcile the seeming implausibility of some of the prosecution's theory? How did Teresa's blood end up in the back of her RAV4 but nowhere in Stephen's trailer or garage where she was supposedly attacked? Why was there no DNA evidence from Teresa in Stephen's bedroom, where Brendan said she was tied to the bed? How could a body be burned so thoroughly in an open fire pit that almost no soft tissue remained? Yet DNA could still be recovered from some bones. On the other hand, if Stephen is innocent and was framed, how do we explain all the evidence? It's one thing to suggest one piece was planted, maybe the key, maybe even the blood in the car, but all of it, the bones in the fire pit, the bullet in the garage, his DNA on the hood latch. Would multiple law enforcement officers really conspire to plant all this evidence, risking their careers and potential criminal charges just to avoid a civil lawsuit? And what about Brendan? If his confession was false, why did he confess at all? Yes, he was young and intellectually limited, and the interrogation tactics were problematic. But he did describe events, did provide details, did tell a story that was compelling enough to convince a jury. Yet, if his confession was true, where is the physical evidence to support it? Not a trace of Teresa's DNA in the bedroom or trailer where he said she was assaulted. No blood evidence despite his descriptions of stabbing and throat cutting. How can that be? There are other questions too. What about Ryan Hillegas, Teresa's ex-boyfriend? He helped organize the search party. He accessed Teresa's phone records. Some have questioned whether he was investigated thoroughly enough. The defense raised his name at trial, but the prosecution dismissed the suggestion. What about Bobby Dassey, Brendan's older brother? He testified that he saw Teresa leave the property that afternoon. But Kathleen Zellner later claimed that Bobby's computer contained disturbing searches for violent pornography around the time of Teresa's death. Could he have been involved? The courts have so far found this theory unpersuasive. What about the burn barrel where Teresa's phone and camera were found? It wasn't Stephen's barrel, it belonged to another family member. Why would Stephen burn evidence in someone else's barrel? And perhaps most fundamentally, if Stephen Avery killed Teresa Halbach, why would he leave her car on his property? He had a car crusher right there at the salvage yard. He could have destroyed the vehicle completely, eliminated that evidence entirely. Instead, he allegedly hid it under some branches at the edge of the property, hidden enough to not be immediately visible, but not destroyed. It seems like an odd choice for someone who supposedly burned a body and cleaned up other evidence. These questions have no simple answers. And that's perhaps the most unsettling aspect of this entire case. We may never know with absolute certainty what happened to Teresa Halbach on October 31st, 2005. In all the debates about evidence and interrogations about conspiracy theories and legal procedure, it's easy to lose sight of the person at the center of this tragedy. Teresa Halbach was 25 years old when she died. She had dreams, plans, people who loved her. She was more than a case file, more than evidence in a trial, more than a topic for podcast discussions and internet debates. Her family has been living with this loss for nearly 2 decades now. They've had to endure the trial, the appeals, the documentaries, the endless public speculation, every new filing, every new motion for a new trial, every new documentary episode brings it all back, reopens wounds that never fully heal. Teresa's mother, Karen, has spoken rarely about the case, but when she has, her words carry the weight of unimaginable grief. She said that whether people believe Stephen Avery is guilty or innocent, they should remember that Teresa was a real person, a beloved daughter and sister, someone whose absence leaves a permanent void in the lives of those who knew her. Teresa's brother, Mike, served as the family spokesperson during much of the investigation and trial. He's maintained that he believes the right people were convicted, that justice was served for his sister. He's asked that people respect the family's privacy, allow them to grieve without constant public scrutiny. In Hilbert, in the community where Teresa grew up, people remember her not as a victim in a famous case, but as the girl who made them laugh. During family portrait sessions, the young woman who coached middle school volleyball with patience and enthusiasm, the photographer with the bright smile who loved to sing along to her favorite songs while driving to assignments. Her family established a scholarship in her name, the Teresa Halbach Memorial Scholarship, to help young people pursue careers in photography and other visual arts. Keeping alive the passion that brought Teresa so much joy, there's a memorial for Teresa at Holy Name Parish in Kaukauna, where her funeral was held. People still leave flowers there sometimes, still pause to remember a life cut short. The murder of Teresa Halbach remains one of the most controversial criminal cases in American history. Two men are serving life sentences for her death. One maintains his innocence and continues to fight for a new trial. The other, once a teenager with limited understanding of the legal system he found himself caught in, serves his sentence in a prison far from home. The debates continue. New evidence is presented and disputed. Appeals are filed and denied. Documentaries are made. Articles are written. People take sides. But none of it brings Teresa back. On Halloween night, 2005, Teresa Halbach was supposed to meet her family at a bar for a party. She never showed up. Instead, her absence set in motion a chain of events that would captivate the world and raise profound questions about justice, truth, and reasonable doubt. Whether you believe Stephen Avery and Brendan Dassey are guilty or innocent, whether you think the evidence was solid or planted, whether you trust the system or question its integrity, one thing remains indisputable. A young woman with her whole life ahead of her was killed. A family lost a daughter, a sister, a friend, and no verdict, no appeal, no documentary can change that fundamental tragedy. As you drift off to sleep tonight, perhaps think of Teresa not as a victim in a famous case, but as a person, someone who loved photography and singing, who wanted to be a mother someday, who made children smile when she photographed them, who had dreams that would never be realized. Her story deserves to be remembered. Not just the controversy and the questions, but the life itself, brief though it was, and bright. If this is your first time listening to one of our true crime stories, welcome to Mr. Sleepy Crime, where we explore these cases in a calm and respectful way. I also want to take a moment to appreciate my amazing subscribers who've been rocking with me. Thank you so much for your continued support. If you're still awake and listening, don't forget to drop a comment. Let me know where you're tuning in from and the current time in your corner of the world. Or just say something to let me know you're still here. And if you haven't already, be sure to like this video and subscribe so you don't miss our next true crime stories for sleep. Now let's move on to our second story. Story 2. Tonight we're going to explore a story that unfolded in the heart of Toronto, Canada. A story about a young woman with dreams of seeing the world, a mother's unwavering determination, and the tragic events of one November night in 2017. This is the story of Tess Richie. Some stories need to be told, not for shock or spectacle, but to remember, to honor. And tonight we remember Tess. Tess Richie was born on November 30th, 1994, in North Bay, Ontario. She was the baby of the family, the youngest of 5 sisters in a close-knit household, where laughter echoed through the halls and love was never in short supply. Her sisters would later say that yes, Tess was spoiled rotten, but she earned it. She was protective, fiercely loyal, and full of life. Growing up in North Bay, Tess attended E.W. Norman Public School and later Whitterfield Secondary School. She wasn't just a student moving through the motions. She was someone who worked hard for what she wanted. As a teenager and young adult, she took on jobs, responsibility, and the kind of determination that impressed everyone around her. Before leaving for Toronto, she worked as an assistant manager at the Days Inn in North Bay. For someone so young, she carried herself with confidence and capability. But Tess had bigger dreams. Dreams that extended beyond the borders of her small hometown. She wanted to fly, literally. Her goal was to become a flight attendant, to see the world from 30,000 feet, to experience cultures and cities that most people only read about in books. So at 19 years old, Tess made the move to Toronto, one of Canada's largest and most vibrant cities. She enrolled in the flight services program at Seneca College, throwing herself into her studies with enthusiasm. And in April of 2017, just months before her life would be tragically cut short, Tess completed the program. She had done it. She had the qualification. Now all she needed was that opportunity, that one chance to step through the door and into the sky. But opportunity moves slowly sometimes. Tess applied to airlines. She applied to hotels. She sent out resume after resume, waiting for that callback. That email, that yes. While she waited, she didn't sit idle. She juggled multiple part-time jobs, working primarily at a coffee bar in downtown Toronto. She was hustling, grinding, doing what so many young people do in big cities, surviving while chasing a dream. And when the airline jobs didn't materialize as quickly as she hoped, Tess didn't give up. She pivoted. She started studying Italian. She began researching au pair positions in Italy. If she couldn't fly professionally just yet, she'd find another way to see the world. She'd immerse herself in a new language, a new culture, a new adventure. Tess lived in Toronto with purpose, but she never lost touch with her roots. Her sister Rachel also lived in the city, and the two were inseparable. Rachel would later describe Tess as her best friend, her soulmate. Despite an 8-year age gap, the bond between them was unshakable. Rachel had helped raise Tess when she was little, and now as adults they created new memories together. Dinners, conversations, laughter, games. The kind of moments that seem ordinary until they're gone. November 24th, 2017 was one of those days, a Friday afternoon. Tess spent it at Rachel's house in Midtown Toronto. They shared a meal, they played games. They talked about life, about dreams, about everything and nothing. It was by all accounts a perfect day, the kind Rachel would replay in her mind 1,000 times afterward. Grateful for every second, agonizing over the fact that she didn't know it would be their last. As evening turned to night, Tess prepared for what should have been a fun, carefree outing. She was meeting up with an old friend from high school, someone she hadn't seen in 2.5 years. The plan was simple: go out to the church in Wellesley neighborhood, Toronto's LGBTQ West District known simply as the Village, and enjoy a night of dancing and reconnection. Tess left Rachel's house around 11:30 p.m. She was in good spirits, excited to catch up with her friend. They met up and made their way to Cruise and Tangos, a popular drag bar on Church Street. The place was packed, alive with music and energy. Students, young professionals, locals, and visitors all mingled under the lights and pounding bass. It was the kind of place where people went to forget their worries, to dance, to be themselves. Tess and her friend, whose name was Riley Samard, drank heavily that night. They were having fun, letting loose, enjoying the freedom of a Friday night in the city. But as the hours passed and the alcohol flowed, things got blurry. Riley would later say that by the time they left the bar, sometime after 1:30 a.m., both of them had consumed a significant amount of alcohol. They stumbled out into the cold November air, the kind of cold that cuts through your jacket and makes you walk faster. They wandered north along Church Street, eventually stopping outside a house on Dundonald Street, just 1 block north of Wellesley. There they struck up a conversation with a woman who lived there and an unidentified man who was standing nearby. But this is where the story begins to fracture, where small decisions lead to enormous consequences. At 4 a.m., Riley received a text from her boyfriend asking her to come home. She was tired, drunk, and ready to call it a night. She said goodbye to Tess and walked to the College Street streetcar, leaving her friend behind. In hindsight, this moment would haunt Riley, but in the moment, it seemed harmless. Tess wasn't alone. There were other people around. Everything seemed fine, except it wasn't. Security footage would later reveal that Tess had not been alone after leaving the bar. Walking behind her and Riley was a young man. His name was Kalen Schlatter. He was 21 years old, slim, with light-colored short hair and khaki pants beneath a dark coat. He had also been at Cruise and Tangos that night, lingering on the outskirts of the crowd after last call, watching Vading. According to later testimony, Schlatter didn't approach Tess and Riley until after they left the bar. He introduced himself on the street, inserting himself into their evening. Tess, who was dealing with the heartache of a recent breakup just 2 days earlier, opened up to this stranger. She told him about her ex-boyfriend. Schlatter, playing the part of a sympathetic listener, called the ex an asshole. He even jokingly suggested they egg the guy's house. At some point during this interaction, something happened that no one could have predicted. Riley left, and Tess stayed. The security footage is chilling in its mundanity. It shows Tess and Kalen walking together up Church Street. At one point, Tess appears to try to hail a cab. Schlatter waves it off, claiming later that the driver was holding up traffic. But the Crown prosecutors would argue something different. They would argue that Schlatter didn't want Tess to leave, that he had plans for her. Around 4:02 a.m., Tess ordered an Uber. It was set to pick her up at 50 Dundonald Street. The driver, Marlon Allenby, arrived at the location and waited. He sent notifications, but Tess never showed up. After 15 minutes, he canceled the ride, noting in the system, "Rider isn't here," because Tess wasn't there anymore. She was with Kaylin Schlatter, and the two of them were walking hand in hand up a gravel driveway toward an outdoor stairwell at 5082 Church Street, a building under renovation, dark and isolated. Security cameras captured them entering the alley at 4:14 a.m., but no cameras were positioned to face the stairwell itself. Only two people would ever know what happened in those stairs, and one of them would never speak again. 45 minutes later, at 4:59 a.m., Kaylin Schroeder emerged from the alley, alone. He walked back the way he came, eventually getting into a taxi. He would later claim he had to get out to vomit, so he called an Uber to finish the trip home. He went to sleep that night as if nothing had happened. But at the bottom of those stairs, in the cold and the dark, Tess Richie lay dead, strangled, her body left like discarded trash in a construction site. Saturday morning, November 25th. Rachel Richie woke up and sent her sister a text, then another, and another. By 8:45 a.m., she was starting to feel a small knot of worry. Tess always replied, always, but the messages weren't being delivered. By that evening, the knot had become a pit of dread. Rachel started calling hospitals, then the police. Something was wrong. She knew it in her bones. The family began piecing together what little information they had. Tess's Fitbit, which was linked to their mother's account, showed that Tess had taken approximately 300 steps after 3 a.m. Her Uber account, also linked to her mother Christine Hermeston's credit card, showed that a ride had been requested at 4:02 a.m. and then canceled. But no one knew who canceled it or why. The Toronto Police Service opened a missing persons investigation, but there was confusion from the start. The case was initially assigned to 41 Division in the east end of the city, where Tess had previously lived, rather than 51 Division, which covered the area where she was last seen. Resources were spread thin, leads were scarce. By November 27th, Christine Hermeston couldn't take it anymore. Her baby was missing, her youngest daughter, and the police hadn't found her. So Christine did what any mother would do. She drove nearly 400 kilometers from North Bay to Toronto, determined to find Tess herself. She brought very little with her: 2 pairs of jeans, borrowed clothes from her daughters. This wasn't a visit. This was a mission. Christine enlisted the help of Anne Brazeau, a nurse who worked at St. Michael's Hospital and whose daughter had been friends with Tess since elementary school. Together, they hit the streets. They made posters, hundreds of them. They walked through the village, handing out flyers, asking questions, searching every alley, every doorway, every shadowy corner. Christine looked into the faces of strangers and begged them, "Have you seen my daughter? Do you know anything? Please help me find her." The police said they were doing everything they could. They set up a command post. They canvassed the area, but Christine couldn't shake the feeling that more needed to be done. That Tess was close, that she was waiting to be found, and she was right. On the afternoon of November 29th, 4 days after Tess disappeared, and 1 day before what would have been her 23rd birthday, Christine and Anne were searching near Church and Dundonald streets. They had been there before, but something pulled Christine back. She would later describe it as an eerie feeling, a pull she couldn't explain. There was a construction site at 502 Church Street, just 2 doors down from where Tess was last seen. The building was under renovation, closed off, dark. Christine and Anne walked up the gravel driveway, and there at the edge of an outdoor stairwell leading to a basement entrance, Anne Brazeau leaned over to peer down into the shadows. What she saw made her blood run cold. At the bottom of the narrow stairwell, lying on the concrete, was a body. The face was blue, the limbs were still. Anne recognized the clothing. She recognized the shape. Terror ripped through her chest. She stumbled backward, her voice breaking as she screamed for Christine. "Christine, come back here. There's a girl in the stairwell. You've got to come back." Christine's scream echoed through the alley, through the street, through the souls of everyone who heard it. "Oh dear God, help me!" Tess Richie had been found, but it was too late. She was already gone. The discovery of Tess's body sent shockwaves through Toronto, not just because of the tragedy itself, but because of where she had been found. 40 meters. That's how far Tess's body was from the address where 2 Toronto police officers had been dispatched. 3 days earlier to check on a missing person report. 40 meters. The length of a few houses, a distance that could be walked in seconds. The officers, Constables Michael Jones and Alan McCullough, had been called to check an address on November 26th, the day after Tess was reported missing. But they didn't search the area thoroughly. They didn't knock on doors. They didn't look into construction sites. They completed their task as assigned and moved on. Later, they would face misconduct charges under the Police Services Act for neglect of duty. The Toronto Police Association defended them, saying they were only assigned a check address call, not a full search. But the damage was done. The public outcry was deafening. How could a young woman's body lie undiscovered for 4 days in a busy neighborhood? How could police walk past the very location where she was hidden and not find her? And how could a mother with no training and no resources succeed where an entire police force had failed? Christine Hermeston's discovery of her daughter's body became a symbol of everything that was broken in the system. She should have been planning Tess's 23rd birthday. Instead, she was identifying her daughter's remains. Initially, police suggested that Tess's death might have been accidental. Perhaps she had fallen. Perhaps it was a tragic mishap. But an autopsy told a different story. Tess had died from neck compression, strangulation. Her death was ruled a homicide. On December 3, 2017, Toronto police released a public appeal. They were looking for an unknown male, described as white, approximately 5'7" to 6 tall, slim build, with light-colored short hair. Security images were released showing a young man in khaki pants and a dark coat. This was a person of interest, someone who might have information, someone who had been seen with Tess before she died. The images circulated widely. Social media exploded with speculation and anger. Who was this man? Why hadn't he come forward? And where was he now? Kellen Schlatter knew exactly where he was. He was at home watching the news coverage, seeing his own face plastered across TV screens and shared thousands of times online. And he said nothing. For weeks, he stayed silent. The Toronto homicide detectives were already closing in. They had the security footage, they had witness statements, and they had evidence that would prove impossible to ignore. On February 4th, 2018, police arrested Kalen Schlatter near his home in Toronto's West End. He was 21 years old, and he was charged with second-degree murder in the death of Tess Richie. Detective Sergeant Graham Gibson addressed the media, calling Tess a young, innocent girl and describing the crime as one of opportunity. Schlatter and Tess had met for the first time that night. They had spent time together, and then he had killed her. As the investigation progressed, the charge was upgraded to first-degree murder, indicating planning and deliberation. But Schlatter maintained his innocence. He would fight the charges. He would tell his side of the story. And in 2020, the case would finally go to trial. The trial of Kalen Schlatter began in early 2020, and it quickly became one of the most closely watched cases in Toronto. For Tess's family, it was agonizing. Sitting in that courtroom day after day, hearing the details of her final hours, seeing the evidence laid out piece by piece. The Crown's case was built on several pillars. First, there was the security footage. The camera showed Tess and Kalen walking together, hand in hand toward the stairwell. 45 minutes later, Kalen emerged alone. An officer who reviewed hours of footage testified that no one else entered or exited that area during the critical time frame. Second, there was forensic evidence. Kalen Schlatter's semen was found on Tess's pants. His saliva was found inside her bra. The Crown argued that Schlatter had sexually assaulted Tess and then strangled her when she refused to have sex with him. Third, there was testimony from a jailhouse informant. A longtime criminal who shared a cell with Schlatter said that Kalen had confessed to the murder. According to this informant, who could only be identified as E.S. Schlatter, described taking Tess to the stairwell, making out with her, and then losing control when she said she didn't want to go further. The informant testified that Schlatter said he strangled Tess with a scarf, that it excited him, and that he ejaculated during the act. After Tess was dead, Schlatter allegedly took $60 from her purse and left. E.S. said that Schlatter showed no remorse, that he cried at night in his cell, but only because he missed his mother and didn't want to go to prison, not because he regretted what he had done to Tess. Fourth, there was testimony from undercover police officers. After Schlatter's arrest, 2 undercover cops were placed in holding cells next to him, pretending to be criminals. They struck up conversations, And Schlatter talked. He bragged about his success with women. He said he liked a challenge, and that sometimes you have to push the boundaries with women to see where it goes. He mentioned having so much upper body strength that it surprises people. At one point, he told the officers that when detectives showed him photos of Tess's body, he pretended to be emotional, but in reality, it didn't bother him at all. The defense painted a very different picture. Schlatter's lawyer, Lydia Riva, argued that the encounter between Tess and Kaylin had been consensual, that Tess had been the one who asked to kiss him, that she had led him to the stairwell, that they had fooled around for a while before Kaylin left her there, alive and well. Schlatter took the stand in his own defense. He denied murdering Tess. He denied sexually assaulting her. He claimed that Tess told him she was on her period, so they couldn't have sex. He said he came in his pants while they were grinding against each other. Embarrassed, he asked Tess if she wanted to come back to his parents' house. She declined, so he left. "I should have stayed with her," Schlatter said, his voice breaking. "I feel terrible." But under cross-examination, Crown Attorney Beverly Richards tore into his story. She showed him the footage of Tess trying to hail a cab. She pointed out his behavior outside the club. Loitering, watching women, waiting. "That's what you do, Mr. Schlatter. You just hang on the outskirts, waiting, don't," she said. Richards accused him of lying, of changing his story. She reminded the jury that Schlatter's DNA was all over Tess's body, that he had walked her to her death, and that he had left her there, alone in the dark, strangled at the bottom of a stairwell. "You left her there dead, didn't you, Mr. Schlatter?"
Richards said.
Schlatter denied it, but the jury didn't believe him. By March 2020, the world was changing. COVID-19 was sweeping across the globe. Courts were shutting down. Trials were being postponed. But the jury in Kaylin Schlatter's case was given a choice. Adjourn or continue. They chose to continue. After 3 days of deliberation in a courthouse that was largely deserted due to pandemic precautions, the jury returned with a verdict. Guilty, first-degree murder. The conviction carried an automatic life sentence with no chance of parole for 25 years. Tess's family wept, some in relief, some in grief, some in a mix of both. Justice had been served, but it would never bring Tess back. At sentencing, Superior Court Justice Michael Dambro addressed Schlatter directly. He referenced evidence that had been kept from the jury. Evidence of Schlatter's sexual interest in choking. "It is true that you are young," the judge said, "but your sexual appetite led you literally to take an innocent young woman by the hand down a path to her death. To satisfy your lust, you took her life. You stole a large piece of the fabric of the very being of the members of her family and friends, and I could not fail to observe. You shed no tear for their losses." Kaylin Schlatter was led away to begin his sentence. He filed an appeal claiming errors in the trial process and the admission of certain evidence. As of now, he remains in prison. For Christine Hermiston and her daughters, the conviction brought some measure of closure, but it could never erase the pain. Tess was gone, and nothing would ever fill that void. In June 2020, the Richie family filed a lawsuit against Kaylin Schlatter and the Toronto Police Service, seeking $20 million in damages. The lawsuit alleged that police failed to properly search for Tess, that they falsely reported her death as a misadventure, and that they made unfounded claims about her working as an escort, all of which compounded the family's suffering. "I'm doing this for Tess," Christine said, "but there's going to be other young girls out there, so it's not just for Tess. I can't get it out of my head that they let her lay there for 4 days." The image of finding her daughter's body is seared into Christine's mind forever. She suffers from PTSD, nightmares, insomnia. All of Tess's sisters do. The family, once so close, struggles to look at each other without feeling guilt, without wondering if they could have done something differently. "We feel like we all let Tess down," Christine said. "And that's why we're continuing to fight on behalf of Tess, because we're not going to let her down again." The 2 officers who were charged with misconduct, Constables Jones and McCullough, eventually had their charges withdrawn in August 2024, 7 years after Tess's death. The resolution involved a restorative approach, with both officers docked 40 days of pay and participating in training for future recruits. The Richie family was divided on the resolution. Rachel Richie expressed relief that further legal proceedings could be avoided, but Christine remains unsatisfied. planning to pursue a civil lawsuit against the officers. As for the Toronto Police Service, Tess's case became a catalyst for change. The failures in her case, combined with other tragedies in the church in Wellesley neighborhood, led the police to create a dedicated missing persons unit. Chief Mark Saunders ordered both internal and external reviews of how the force handles missing persons investigations. But no amount of policy change can bring back the young woman who dreamed of flying, who loved her family fiercely, who spent her last afternoon playing games and laughing with her sister. Tess Richie was 22 years old when she died. She was 4 days away from her 23rd birthday. She had completed her flight attendant training. She was learning Italian. She was looking toward a future filled with travel, adventure, and possibility. Instead, she met a stranger on a cold November night. A stranger who saw her not as a person, but as an opportunity. And in 45 minutes, her life was over. Evil not only took Tess that night, her sister Verena said. It sentenced her surviving family to a cruel and painful future while robbing the world of so much love and potential. Tess's story is a reminder of how fragile life can be, how a single decision, a single moment can change everything. It's a reminder to stay close to the people we love, to check in, to never assume that tomorrow is guaranteed. And it's a reminder that when someone goes missing, every second matters. Every search matters. Every person who helps matters. Christine Hermiston found her daughter when the system failed. And though the pain of that discovery will haunt her forever, her love for Tess drove her to seek justice, to fight for accountability, to make sure that other families might be spared the same nightmare. Tess Richie's life mattered. Her dreams mattered. Her love for her family mattered. And though she is gone, she is not forgotten. If you're still awake and listening, check whether you've left your little goodnight comment. I always check your comments before I sleep too. And if you haven't already, don't forget to like this video and subscribe so you don't miss our next true crime stories for sleep. Meanwhile, let's move on to our third story. Story 3. Sometimes the most dangerous poison isn't the one you can taste. Sometimes it's the one sweetened with false promises and wrapped in the familiar comfort of home. Tonight we travel to the windswept plains of North Dakota, to a small city called Minai, where a decade-long love story ended not with a goodbye but with a glass of sweet tea on a sweltering September afternoon. This is the story of Stephen Riley and Anna Kenoer, a story of second chances that became a final betrayal, of a fortune that never existed, and a life that was stolen because of it. Let's begin. The year was 2013, and both Stephen Riley and Anna Kenoer were looking for something they'd lost. Hope. Stephen Riley was originally from California, a 51-year-old man who'd lived a complicated life. He had been married twice before and was the father of 5 children. Life hadn't always been kind to Stephen. He'd struggled with homelessness, found himself sleeping in shelters, wondering if tomorrow would bring anything better than today. But Stephen had something that kept him going, an optimistic spirit, a belief that things could turn around. It was in one of those California homeless shelters that Stephen met Anna Kenoer. She was 47 years old, also battling her own demons, also looking for a fresh start. In the shared experience of struggle, they found each other's. Something about rock bottom that either breaks you or bonds you to the people you meet there. For Stephen and Ina, it seemed to be the latter. They made plans together. Big plans. They would leave California, with all its expensive dreams and broken promises, and head north to North Dakota, Minaitu to be specific, a city of about 48,000 people sitting just 50 miles south of the Canadian border. It was a place where the cost of living was lower, where maybe they could rebuild their lives together, where second chances felt possible, and for a time it seemed to work. They moved to Minot and settled into a modest home. Stephen referred to Ina often, and she did the same, calling herself his wife, though they never legally married. For 10 years they built what looked like a life together. To friends and neighbors, they were a couple who had pulled each other out of darkness. They had their problems, as all couples do, but they had survived. Stephen's children from his previous marriages stayed in touch. His son Ryan was working on rebuilding his relationship with his father. His sister Stephanie Gonzalez watched from afar, grateful that her brother seemed to have found stability after years of chaos. But beneath the surface of this decade-long relationship, something had begun to crack. Stephen was getting restless. Inata was growing resentful. And both of them were about to be swept up in something that would expose the fault lines of their relationship in the most catastrophic way possible. In the late summer of 2023, Stephen Riley received an email that seemed too good to be true, because the email claimed to be from an attorney representing a distant relative Stephen had never met. According to the message, this relative had died and left Stephen a staggering inheritance. Some versions of the story said $17 million. Others said it was as much as $30 million. The exact number seemed to change, but the core claim remained the same. Stephen Riley, the man who had once slept in shelters, was about to become extraordinarily wealthy. Now, to most people hearing this story, alarm bells would be ringing. This is all the hallmarks of a classic inheritance scam, one of the oldest tricks in the fraudster's playbook. Send an email to someone claiming they're the beneficiary of a fortune from a relative they've never heard of. Ask them to send money for processing fees or legal costs, and vanish with whatever the victim sends. But Stephen Riley didn't see it that way, and neither did Inakinoair. To understand why, you have to understand what it means to have spent years with almost nothing. When you've been homeless, when you've struggled just to keep a roof over your head. The idea of sudden wealth doesn't seem absurd. It seems like the universe finally paying back what it owes you. It seems like justice. It seems like the happy ending you've been promised your whole life, but never received. Stephen and Ina believed the inheritance was real. 100% real. Stephen began making plans. He contacted the supposed attorney, arranged meetings, talked about what he would do with the money. And he made another decision, one that would ultimately cost him his life. Stephen told his friends that once he received the inheritance, he was planning to leave Inea. The relationship had grown strained. They weren't the same people who had met in that California shelter 10 years earlier. Whatever had once bound them together was fraying. Stephen saw the inheritance as his chance at true independence. A chance to start over again, this time on his own terms. But Inea overheard things. Friends and neighbors later told police that Inea had picked up on Stephen's intentions. She knew he was planning to leave. And she knew that if he did, she would be left with nothing. No money, no husband, no security. After 10 years together, she would be back where she started. There was just one problem with Inea's logic. North Dakota doesn't recognize common law marriage, even though she referred to herself as Stephen's wife. Even though they'd lived together for a decade. Legally speaking, she had no claim to his assets. But Inea didn't know that yet. All she knew was that Stephen was about to become rich, and he was about to leave her, and she decided she couldn't let that happen. The temperature in Minneapolis, on September 3rd, 2023, climbed into the low 90s. It was an unseasonably warm day, the kind where the heat seems to press down on everything, making the air feel thick and heavy. Stephen Riley had an appointment that day at the Minneapolis International Airport. The attorney handling his supposed inheritance had finally agreed to meet him in person to complete the transaction. Stephen was excited. This was it. The day his life would change forever. He invited friends to come along, witnesses to his good fortune. But something happened before Stephen left for the airport. Something his friends noticed but couldn't quite explain at the time. Earlier that afternoon, Ina was seen throwing Stephen's belongings out of their house. Not just setting them outside, but angrily tossing his property onto the lawn. A friend of the couple, Rebecca Mello, witnessed the scene and later told police that Ina seemed furious. She was clearly upset about something, clearly angry with Stephen. But when it came time to go to the airport, Anna went with him. She and Stephen drove to the small airport together, meeting up with several friends who wanted to be there for Stephen's big moment. And that's when Stephen started feeling sick. At first, it seemed minor. Stephen complained of stomach pain. He felt dizzy, unsteady on his feet. He told his friends he felt drunk, even though he hadn't had anything to drink. His friend Billy Burkhead had been with Stephen just the day before, and said Stephen had seemed perfectly fine. No signs of illness, no indication that anything was wrong. But now, at the airport, Stephen was deteriorating rapidly. Within an hour of arriving, he began vomiting. He couldn't walk without help. He seemed to drift in and out of consciousness, his eyes unfocused. His words slurred. His friends became alarmed. They wanted to call an ambulance, wanted to take Stephen to the emergency room immediately. But Ina stopped them. She insisted that Stephen was just suffering from heat stroke. She claimed to have medical training and said she knew exactly what to do. Stephen didn't need a hospital, she said. He just needed to go home and rest. Stephen's friend Wesley Torgerson was especially concerned. He trusted Ina because she claimed to know about heat stroke treatment, and the temperature had been in the 90s. But watching Stephen deteriorate, Torgerson felt a gnawing worry in his gut. Something wasn't right. Still, Ina was insistent. She took Stephen home. The attorney never showed up at the airport that day, because there was no attorney. There never had been. What happened inside that house on the night of September 3rd? No one will ever fully know except Ina Kenoir. But we know Stephen Riley was dying. We know that throughout the day, and it had been making Stephen sweet tea. She would later admit this to police. Sweet tea on a hot day. Something refreshing, something familiar, something to cool him down. Stephen drank it without suspicion. Why would he? This was the woman he'd lived with for 10 years. This was the woman he'd crossed the country with, built a life with. But the sweet tea contained something else. Something that would mask its presence with its own sweetness. Ethylene glycol, the main ingredient in antifreeze. Ethylene glycol is a deadly poison, but its initial effects can be deceived. When first ingested, it acts like alcohol on the body. The victim feels intoxicated, dizzy, confused. They might vomit. They might lose coordination. To someone who doesn't know what's happening, it could easily be mistaken for drunkenness or illness. But what ethylene glycol does inside the body is catastrophic. It metabolizes into toxic compounds that attack the kidneys, the heart, the brain. Without immediate treatment, it's lethal. And even with treatment, if too much time passes, there's nothing doctors can do. Stephen's friends didn't stop worrying. Wesley Torgerson decided to check on Stephen the next morning, September 4th. When he called the house, Ina told him that Stephen had already gone to a walk-in clinic and was being treated. Relieved, Torgerson decided to visit some of the clinics to see which one Stephen had gone to. Maybe bring him something or just check in. But Torgerson couldn't find Stephen at any clinic. He checked every walk-in facility in Manit. He checked the emergency room at Trinity Hospital. Stephen Riley hadn't been admitted anywhere. Ina had lied. Growing more alarmed, Torgerson tried calling the house again. No answer. Hours passed. The day wore on. And finally, later that afternoon, emergency services received a 911 call from Ina Kenoir. When paramedics arrived at the house, they found Stephen Riley unconscious. He was unresponsive, his breathing shallow, his body shutting down. They transported him immediately to Trinity Hospital in Menad. But his condition was so severe that he had to be airlifted to CHI, Alexius Medical Center in Bismarck, about 100 miles away. Stephen Riley never regained consciousness. He died on September 5, 2023, with his family receiving the terrible news by phone. He was 51 years old. The official cause of death, ethylene glycol poisoning. Stephen Riley's friends and family knew almost immediately that something was wrong. This wasn't a random tragedy. This wasn't an accident. They remembered the comments Anita had made over the years. Dark jokes, strange references to poisoning someone with antifreeze. At the time, people had dismissed them as morbid humor, the kind of thing someone says without really meaning. But now those comments took on a sinister new meaning. They remembered that at the airport, even before anyone knew what was wrong with Stephen. Ina had insisted he didn't need medical help. She'd prevented his friends from calling an ambulance when time was literally life or death. And they remembered that while Stephen was in the hospital, before anyone had told her his diagnosis, Ina had begun saying that Stephen had been poisoned with antifreeze. How could she know that? The medical staff hadn't said anything. The toxicology results hadn't come back yet, but Ina was already talking about antifreeze poisoning. The coroner was informed of these suspicions, and tests were ordered specifically looking for ethylene glycol. The results came back showing toxic levels in Stephen's blood. This was murder. Friends and family immediately contacted the Mineo Police Department. They told detectives about Ina's strange comments, about the inheritance Stephen was supposed to receive, about the fact that Stephen had been planning to leave Ina once he got the money. The Mineo police launched an investigation. It was, in the words of Investigations Commander Captain Dale Plessas, extremely complex. but the pieces began falling into place. Detectives obtained a search warrant for the home Stephen and Ina shared. What they found was chilling. In the living room, officers discovered an old Windex bottle, the cap missing, filled with bright green liquid. In the garage, they found a glass Coors Light beer bottle containing antifreeze. They found a plastic beer mug, also with antifreeze residue. These weren't just cleaning supplies stored carelessly. This was evidence of a murder weapon hidden in plain sight. Investigators brought in a canoyer for questioning. At first, she stuck to her story. Stephen had been drinking all day. He'd suffered heat stroke. She tried to help him. But as detectives pressed her, presenting the evidence they'd found, the story began to change. According to Detective Aaron Bonney, who worked on the case, Ina eventually started offering alternative explanations. Maybe, she suggested, Stephen had been smoking a cigarette that fell into antifreeze in the garage, and then he smoked it. Maybe he'd accidentally ingested it somehow. She even pulled up Google on her phone during the interview, showing detectives that heat stroke symptoms could mimic poisoning. But then detectives asked Ina about the inheritance. Did she know about it? Yes, she admitted. She knew all about it. She knew Stephen was supposed to receive $30 million. And what did she expect to happen with that money? She planned to split it with Stephen's son, she said, because as Stephen's common-law wife, she was entitled to a portion. That's when Detective Bill DeNovio told her the truth. North Dakota doesn't recognize common-law marriage. Legally, she had no claim to Stephen's money, no matter how long they'd been together. According to the affidavit, Ina went ballistic. She exploded in anger. There was, Detective DeNovio said, just kind of an explosion of anger. That was the moment. Investigators believed when Ina realized she'd killed Stephen for nothing. The inheritance didn't exist, and even if it had, she wouldn't have gotten a penny. Finally, Ina Kenoyer admitted what she'd done. She'd put antifreeze in Stephen's sweet tea on September 3rd. She'd given it to him throughout the day. She'd watched him get sick, watched his friends try to help him, and she'd prevented them from getting him the medical care that might have saved his life. She'd killed him. On October 30th, 2023, nearly 2 months after Stephen Riley's death, Inathea Kenoyer was arrested and charged with Class A felony murder, the most severe murder charge in North Dakota. For several months, the case moved through the North Dakota legal system. Ina Kenoyer faced a potential sentence of life in prison without the possibility of parole. She initially requested an attorney, but represented herself for a time during the early proceedings. Then in May 2024, something unexpected happened. Ina Kenoyer changed her plea. Instead of proceeding to trial, she pleaded guilty to 1 count of intentional murder with extreme indifference. On October 16, 2024, it appeared before North Central District Court Judge Richard Hager for sentencing. The courtroom heard victim impact statements from Stephen's family, testimonies that revealed the profound pain his death had caused. Stephen's sister, Stephanie Gonzalez, addressed the court directly, speaking to Ina. You stole more than a human life. You stole a son from his mother and stepfather. You stole a father from 5 sons, a brother from 2 sisters, an uncle from 12 nieces and nephews, and a great-uncle to 8, and many friends. How does it feel to have taken so much for absolutely nothing? She added with bitter irony, lucky for you that the Department of Corrections doesn't serve antifreeze in their iced tea. Stephen's son, Ryan Riley, spoke about the burden of losing his father just as they had begun rebuilding their relationship. I don't think there's anything more important than family, Ryan said. To have you take away someone so important, it's just hurtful. I can't even find the words to describe how I feel and how much it burdens everyone. I just wish none of this ever happened. Ryan also spoke about his father's legacy. I believe my dad's legacy was wanting to be a type of man to always be there to make everyone happy and just kind of live in the moment. When Judge Hagar asked Ina Kenoyer if she had anything to say, she remained silent. She offered no apology, no explanation, no final words for the family of the man she'd killed. Judge Hagar accepted a joint sentencing recommendation, 50 years in prison, with 25 years to be served and 25 years suspended, followed by 10 years of supervised probation. Ina was also ordered to pay $3,045 in restitution to Stephen's family. Inathea Kenoyer is currently serving her sentence at the Dakota Women's Correctional Facility and Rehabilitation Center. She will be 73 years old if she serves her full sentence and is released. One of the most tragic aspects of this case is that Stephen Riley died for nothing. The $30 million inheritance was a scam from the beginning. Police investigated the supposed attorney who was meant to meet Stephen at the airport that day, and found no evidence that person ever existed. The emails Stephen received were part of a fraudulent scheme, probably originating from scammers operating overseas, hoping to extract money from Stephen for legal fees or processing costs. Stephen never inherited a fortune. He was never going to become wealthy. The life-changing windfall he believed was coming was nothing but pixels on a screen. Empty promises from a criminal who never even knew Stephen's name. And in a canoe, believing the money was real, killed the man she'd spent 10 years with. The man who'd been her partner through homelessness, who'd moved across the country with her to start over, who'd shared a decade of her life. She killed him for a fortune that didn't exist, expecting to claim a share through a common law marriage that wasn't legally recognized. In the end, she received nothing. No money, no freedom, no future. Just 25 years in a prison cell, and the knowledge that she murdered someone she once loved for a lie. Sometimes when we think about true crime, we think about it in terms of good and evil, of monsters and victims. But cases like the murder of Stephen Riley remind us that real life is often more complicated than that. Inekenoye wasn't a monster who killed for sport. She was a woman who'd struggled with homelessness, who'd built a life with someone, and who, when faced with the prospect of losing everything, made a choice that destroyed two lives, Stephen's and her own. Greed is one of the oldest motives for murder. But this wasn't the greed of someone who had everything and wanted more. This was the desperate greed of someone who'd had nothing for so long that the promise of wealth became something she was willing to kill for. The irony is that she killed for money that never existed, revealing just how powerful desperation and fear can be. Stephen Riley deserved better. He deserved the second chance he'd been working toward. He deserved to watch his children grow up, to reconnect with his son, to live out the rest of his days in peace. He deserved to discover the truth about the inheritance scam and move forward with his life. Instead, he died on a September afternoon in North Dakota, killed by someone he trusted, someone who made him sweet tea on a hot day. In memory of Stephen Riley, may his legacy, as his son Ryan said, be one of kindness, of living in the moment, of being there for the people who need you. And may we all remember that no amount of money, real or imagined, is worth a human life. Please, I'm just putting it out there. If you're still awake and listening, drop a comment. Let me know where you're tuning in from, the time in your part of the world, or just say something to let me know you're still with me. And of course, if you haven't already, like this video and subscribe so you don't miss the next true crime story for sleep. Now, let's move on to our fourth story. Story 4. Tonight, let me tell you a story. This is a true story, one that reminds us how trust can sometimes be misplaced, and how the people we invite into our lives can harbor secrets we never imagined. This is the story of Maribel Ramos, a woman of incredible strength and determination, whose life was cut short by someone she thought was a friend. Let's begin at the beginning. Maribel Manriquez Ramos was born on November 22nd, 1976, in Mexico. Her family brought her to the United States when she was just a child, searching for a better life, for opportunity, for the American dream. And Maribel embodied that dream from the very start. She was a tomboy, strong-willed and hard-working, the kind of child who knew what she wanted and wasn't afraid to chase it. From an early age, Maribel had one clear vision for her future. She wanted to work in law enforcement. She wanted to protect people, to serve her community, to make a difference. After high school, she took a job as a security guard at Kmart, saving money and planning her next steps. She knew that to become a police officer, she would need a college degree, and to afford college, she would need to find a way. In 2001, Maribel found that way. She joined the United States Army. Just 1 month after she enlisted, the world changed. September 11, 2001, brought terror to American soil. And suddenly, the military career Maribel had chosen became something much more immediate, much more dangerous. But Maribel didn't back down. She served with distinction, deploying twice to Iraq during some of the most intense periods of the war. She saw combat. She experienced things that would mark her forever, but she survived. and in 2008, after 8 years of service, she was honorably discharged. Sergeant Maribel Ramos came home to California with her head held high. She moved in with her mother and enrolled at California State University, Fullerton. She was going to finish what she'd started. She was going to get that degree in criminal justice. And then she was going to become a police officer, just like she'd always dreamed. But life had one more tragedy in store for her before she could reach that goal. In 2009, Maribel's mother passed away. The loss devastated her. Her mother had been her anchor, her support system. Now at 32 years old, Maribel found herself alone, grieving, and struggling to make ends meet. She couldn't afford the apartment on her own. She needed help. She needed a roommate. So she did what millions of people do when they need to find someone quickly. She posted an ad on Craigslist. Among the responses that came flooding in was one from a man named Kwang Chol Joy. He went by KC. In his message, KC described himself as quiet, easygoing, clean, and professional. He was 55 years old, single, with no children. He was looking for a place to stay while he searched for work. He seemed harmless. He seemed perfect. So Maribel made the decision. Casey Joy moved into her apartment in Orange, California. At first, everything seemed to validate that decision. Casey was exactly as advertised. He was low maintenance, kept his space clean, barely made a sound. He spent most of his time in his room, or quietly around the apartment. He never had friends over, never threw parties, never caused problems. For Maribel, who was juggling her studies and trying to rebuild her life after losing her mother, having such a peaceful roommate felt like a blessing. But here's the thing about Casey Joy. He was lonely, deeply, profoundly lonely. Casey had come to California from Tennessee after a series of devastating personal losses. Both of his parents had died. He'd lost his job, and his relationship with his sister had deteriorated so badly over disputes about their inheritance that she'd taken out a restraining order against him. His sister would later tell investigators that she was terrified of KC, that he had a violent temper she'd witnessed firsthand. But Maribel didn't know any of this. What she saw was a quiet, somewhat sad man who seemed to have no one in the world. And Maribel, with her big heart and her natural compassion, couldn't stand to see anyone suffering from loneliness. She started inviting KC to family gatherings. She brought him along to events, introduced him to her relatives, made him feel included. Her family welcomed him warmly. They felt sorry for him, this middle-aged man with no connections, no support system. Lucy would later say, "It's sad because we felt his loneliness." KC became part of the family. And for Maribel, he became more than just a roommate. He became a friend. They would run errands together, walk their dogs in the neighborhood, chat about their days. To anyone watching from the outside, they looked like the perfect roommate situation. Comfortable, easy, safe. But for Casey Joy, something else was happening. Something Maribel didn't see, or perhaps didn't want to see. He was falling in love with her. The first sign that something was wrong came during a phone call to Lucy. Casey called Maribel's sister one day and told her quite directly that he was in love with Maribel. He wanted to marry her. He wanted to have children with her. He saw a future with her. Lucy was immediately concerned. She knew her sister. She knew Maribel didn't feel that way about Casey. And she could hear in Casey's voice that this wasn't just a passing crush. This was something deeper, something more intense. She warned Maribel to be careful. But Casey's feelings didn't stop at confession. They began to manifest in increasingly desperate ways. He started buying Maribel expensive gifts. He bought himself an entirely new wardrobe, trying to look more appealing. When Maribel casually mentioned one day that she thought tattoos looked good, Casey went out and got a large tiger tattooed on his arm. When that didn't work, when Maribel still didn't see him as anything more than a friend, Casey took even more drastic measures. He spent over $10,000 on cosmetic surgery. He had a procedure done on his eyes to make himself look younger. He was trying to transform himself into someone Maribel might find attractive. He paid for her to go on a cruise with him, hoping that the romantic setting might change her feelings. But nothing worked. Maribel didn't see Casey as a romantic partner. She couldn't. She saw him as her roommate, as a friend, perhaps even as someone she felt sorry for. but not as someone she could love. And for Casey, that rejection, that inability to win her affection no matter what he did, began to fester into something darker. By the spring of 2013, the situation in the apartment had become tense. Casey had stopped paying his share of the rent. When Marble confronted him about it, he made excuses. He said he didn't have the money. He said he'd pay soon. He said he needed more time. But the weeks went by, and no money came. Maribel was in a difficult position. She was a student, working her way through school, about to graduate in just days with her criminal justice degree. She'd already had her hair colored and styled for her commencement ceremony. Everything she'd worked for was finally coming together, but now she had a roommate who wasn't paying his share, and she couldn't afford to carry him anymore. In late April 2013, Maribel told Casey he needed to move out by the end of the month. Casey refused. He made more excuses. He said he had nowhere to go. He said he needed more time. The deadline came and went. May arrived and Casey was still there. The tension escalated. The arguments became more frequent, more heated. And then on a day in late April, something happened that frightened Maribel enough to do something she'd never done before. She called 911. The call came in on April 21st, 2013, 11 days before Maribel would disappear. The operator answered, and on the other end was Maribel's voice. She was crying. She was afraid. She told the operator that she just had an argument with her roommate. She said she was scared of him, and then she said something chilling. "I'm just calling to let you guys know that if something happens, that I did it because I was trying to defend myself." She was making a record. She was documenting her fear, because Maribel Ramos, who had served 2 combat tours in Iraq, who had faced enemies on foreign soil, was now afraid in her own home. She went on, her voice shaking. "If he comes after me, I swear, I will kill him. And I want you to know, it's in self-defense." The operator took down the information. The call was noted, but no immediate action was taken. There had been no assault, no direct threat, just a woman's fear, documented in a police database. The defense would later claim that Maribel had been drinking when she made that call, that she was prone to paranoia because of PTSD from her military service. They would say she was being irrational, but the prosecution would point out that this was a combat veteran, someone trained to assess threats, someone who knew danger when she saw it, and she saw danger in Casey Joy. On May 2nd, 2013, 12 days after that 911 call, Maribel and Casey had another argument. This one was worse than the others. Maribel was on the phone with her boyfriend, Paul Lopez, and she had him on speakerphone. Paul could hear the entire confrontation. Maribel was telling Casey in no uncertain terms that he needed to leave. Not at the end of the month. Not when it was convenient. Tomorrow. He needed to be gone tomorrow. Casey refused. The argument grew heated. And then the call ended. That evening at 7:15, surveillance cameras at the apartment complex captured Maribel dropping off her rent check at the property manager's office. She was alone. She looked normal, going about her routine. It was the last time anyone would see Maribel Ramos alive. The next day, May 3rd, Maribel didn't show up for her weekly softball game. Her friends tried to call her. No answer. They tried again. Nothing. This wasn't like Maribel at all. She was reliable, punctual, always in touch. If she was going to miss something, she'd let people know. Her family went to her apartment. Her car was in the garage. Her belongings were still there, but Maribel was gone. Her phone was gone. Her purse was gone. But everything else looked normal. There were no signs of a struggle. No evidence of what had happened. Casey Joy was there. He told Maribel's family that she hadn't come home the night before. He seemed concerned, cooperative. He joined in the search efforts. He posted on social media about how worried he was, how much he missed his friend. On May 3rd, Maribel's family reported her missing. The Orange County Police Department immediately began investigating. They started with the usual suspects, the men in Maribel's life. She had been using the dating site Plenty of Fish, and she'd been talking to several men. Detectives tracked them all down. Paul Lopez, her boyfriend, was questioned. He'd been on the phone with her the night she disappeared, but he had an alibi for the rest of the evening. He was at work. Security footage and phone records confirmed it. He was cleared. 2 other men she'd been messaging on the dating site were similarly cleared. Their alibis checked out. That left Casey Joy. Detectives spoke with him multiple times. He was cooperative, or at least he appeared to be. He told them about the argument on May 2nd. He admitted that Marble had wanted him to move out, but he insisted he had nothing to do with her disappearance. He said he was worried about her. He said he cared about her more than anyone. But the police weren't buying it. They knew about the 911 call. They knew about Casey's obsession. They knew about the unpaid rent and the arguments. And when they looked at Casey more closely, they noticed something. He had scratches and cuts on his arms. When they asked him about them, Casey said he'd gotten them from walking his dog through some thorn bushes. Plausible. Maybe. But suspicious. Definitely. The police seized Casey's phone and his laptop to search for evidence. And that's when Casey started going to the Orange County Public Library every day. He needed to use the internet, he explained. He didn't have his devices anymore. The police thought that was very interesting, so they started monitoring the library computers. They assigned an IT specialist to watch Casey's activity whenever he logged on, and what they saw was damning. Casey was obsessively searching for news about Maribel's case. He was reading every article, every social media post, every update. He was commenting on Facebook posts about her disappearance, expressing his grief and his hope that she'd be found. And then on May 16, 2013, Casey did something that would seal his fate. He searched for information about how long it takes for a human body to decay. The police watching saw that search. They made note of it. They kept watching. And then Casey opened Google Maps. He zoomed in on a specific area in Modjeska Canyon, a remote, desolate region in the mountains east of Orange. He focused on a particular tree, zooming in close, studying the terrain around it. Then he deleted his browser history and left the library. But he hadn't deleted it fast enough. The police had seen everything. On May 17, 2013, a search party was dispatched to Modjeska Canyon. They went to the exact location Casey Joy had been viewing on Google Maps. They searched the area around that tree. It took them less than an hour. They found a shallow grave. And in that grave they found the decomposed remains of Maribel Ramos. The police went to arrest Casey Joy immediately. When he saw the officers approaching his door, he panicked. He ran to a window and jumped out, trying to escape. He didn't get far. The police tackled him and took him into custody. Casey Joy was charged with the murder of Maribel Ramos. The case presented significant challenges for prosecutors. Maribel's body had been in that shallow grave for 2 weeks in the Southern California heat. The decomposition was so advanced that the coroner couldn't determine a cause of death. There was no forensic evidence tying Casey directly to the killing. No weapon was found. No blood evidence in the apartment. But the circumstantial evidence was overwhelming. The prosecution laid out their theory. After the argument on May 2nd, after Maribel had given him the ultimatum to leave the next day, Casey had waited until Maribel went to sleep. Then, knowing that Maribel had military combat training and could easily overpower him in a fair fight, he'd crept into her room and attacked her while she was defenseless. They believed he'd smothered her in her sleep. Then he'd disposed of her body in that remote canyon, thinking no one would ever find it. The defense argued something entirely different. Casey's attorney, Adam Vinning, told the jury that yes, a crime had been committed, but it wasn't murder. It was improper disposal of a body. He suggested that Maribel, suffering from PTSD and prone to paranoia, might have died of a medical condition or even by suicide. Casey, finding her dead and panicking, had disposed of the body rather than calling the police. It was a thin argument, and the prosecution tore it apart. They pointed to the 911 call where Maribel had documented her fear. They pointed to Casey's obsession, the plastic surgery, the expensive gifts, the refusal to accept that Maribel didn't love him back. They pointed to the internet searches, the body decomposition, the Google Maps zoom on the exact location of the grave. The defendant did a virtual drive-by of where he dumped the body. Deputy District Attorney Scott Simmons told the jury. And then Simmons delivered what might have been the most powerful line of the trial. Maribel was his life, and the opportunity for him to be with the love of his life was coming to an end. The jury deliberated. On July 29, 2014, they returned with their verdict. Not guilty of first-degree murder, but guilty of second-degree murder. Casey Joy showed no emotion as the verdict was read. He simply blinked and stared straight ahead. On September 12, 2014, Casey Joy stood before the court for sentencing. He was given the opportunity to address the court, to say anything he wanted before the judge handed down his sentence. He didn't apologize. He didn't express remorse. Instead, he maintained his innocence. "I cared for Maribel more than anyone in here," he said. "She knows it. She told me so. Family wants me to apologize, which I cannot apologize for something I haven't done. Maybe someday the truth will come out. Maybe I'll just die inside prison." Lucy Gonzalez, Maribel's sister, sat in the courtroom listening to this. She wanted to scream at him. She wanted to tell him to stop lying, to stop pretending, to stop insulting her sister's memory. Instead, she spoke to reporters afterward. "He killed my sister, and then he sits there and says he is the person who misses her the most," she said. "It's disgusting." The judge sentenced Casey Joy to 15 years to life in state prison. He was led away in handcuffs. Before he disappeared from the courtroom, he'd already announced his intention to write a book about his case. He planned to call it Suspect Guilty Until Proven Innocent. To this day, Casey Joy maintains that he didn't kill Maribel Ramos. He has appealed his conviction multiple times. All of his appeals have been denied. According to prison records, he is currently incarcerated at the Correctional Training Facility in Soledad, California. He became eligible for parole in December 2023. Maribel Ramos was 36 years old when she died. She was days away from graduating with her degree in criminal justice. Her cap and gown were hanging in her closets. Her hair had been freshly styled for the ceremony. She was so close to achieving everything she'd worked for. She'd survived 2 combat tours in Iraq. She'd served her country with honor. She'd come home and rebuilt her life after losing her mother. She'd worked hard, studied hard, planned for a future in law enforcement where she could help people, protect people, make a difference. And all of that was stolen from her by a man she'd shown kindness to, a man she'd invited into her home, a man she'd considered a friend. The case raises uncomfortable questions about the nature of obsession, about how unrequited feelings can curdle into something dangerous. Casey Joy spent thousands of dollars trying to make Maribel love him. He changed his appearance, bought her gifts, transformed himself in every way he could think of. And when none of it worked, when Maribel still didn't return his feelings, he couldn't accept it. He couldn't let her move on with her life without him in it. The 911 call Maribel made, 11 days before her death, haunts everyone who hears it. She knew. Some part of her knew she was in danger. She tried to document it, to protect herself, to make sure that if something happened, people would know she'd been afraid. But it wasn't enough. Her family established a memorial softball tournament in her honor. They wanted people to remember not how she died, but how she lived. They wanted people to remember her strength, her determination, her kindness, her service to her country. They wanted people to remember that Maribel Ramos was a hero, and she deserved so much better than the fate that found her. The murder of Maribel Ramos is a tragedy that never should have happened. It's a story about trust betrayed, about kindness exploited, about a woman whose compassion toward a lonely man cost her everything. Tonight, as you drift off to sleep, remember Maribel. Remember her dreams, her ambitions, her service. Remember that she was more than a victim. She was a daughter, a sister, a friend, a soldier. She was someone who wanted to make the world a better place. And in remembering her, perhaps we can all be a little more vigilant, a little more aware of the warning signs of obsession and unhealthy attachment. Perhaps we can honor her memory by looking out for one another, by taking seriously when someone says they're afraid, by understanding that sometimes the people who seem the quietest, the most harmless, can be hiding the darkest intentions. Please, if you're still awake, let's move on to our last story. Story 5. Tonight, we travel back to November 1994, to a quiet suburban neighborhood in Springfield, Virginia, where a promising life was cut short in an act of senseless violence that would haunt a family for 3 decades. This is the story of Robin Lawrence, a gifted artist, a devoted mother, and a woman whose murder remained unsolved for nearly 30 years, until advances in DNA technology finally brought the truth to light. Robin Ward Lawrence was born in 1957 in Ithaca, New York, into a family that would leave its mark on history. Her father, Robert Ward, became the first black common councilor on the Syracuse Common Council, serving their community with distinction during the late 1960s and early 1970s. Growing up in Syracuse alongside her sister Mary Ward Cowens and brother Robert Ward Jr., Robin was surrounded by a family that valued service, achievement, and expression. From her earliest years, Robin possessed a remarkable artistic talent. She won a drawing competition at the Everson Museum and earned several prizes in the following years. Her passion for creativity wasn't limited to visual arts. She was also passionate about dancing, moving through life with the grace and expressiveness that would define her character. Robin's artistic journey led her to Carnegie Mellon College of Fine Arts, where she honed her skills in graphic design and visual arts. After graduating, Robin relocated to Washington, D.C., where she met the love of her life, Ollie Lawrence. The connection between them was immediate and profound. They began dating and eventually moved to Virginia together, building a life filled with hopes and dreams. They married and welcomed a daughter named Nicole into the world. By 1994, the Lawrence family had settled into their home on Resica Lane in West Springfield, Virginia. Robin was employed at Merchants Tire and Auto Center in Meneses as the director of advertising, where her artistic vision and creative expertise helped shape the company's public image. Everything seemed to be falling into place for the young family. They were working on home improvements, fixing up their yard, creating the kind of life that so many aspire to, one filled with love, work, and the simple joys of watching their daughter grow. Robin's niece, Lauren Ovens, who was only 8 years old at the time, would later remember her aunt with deep affection. "She always made me feel so loved and helped me express myself," Lauren recalled. "She was very expressive. She was an artist. She was a dancer." November 1994 should have been a time of preparation and anticipation. Thanksgiving was approaching, and families across America were making plans for gatherings, meals, and celebrations. For the Lawrence family, however, the holiday would forever be marked by tragedy. Ollie was on a business trip in Nassau, Bahamas, traveling for work as an airline executive. Robin went to work that Friday, came home, and dropped off their nanny around 6:30 in the evening. It was a routine end to what seemed like an ordinary day. The last time anyone had heard from Robin was around 6 p.m. on Friday, November 18th. What happened next would remain a mystery for nearly 3 decades. Somewhere around 9:30 that evening, as darkness settled over the quiet Springfield neighborhood, a 22-year-old Army soldier named Stephen Smirk left his barracks at Fort Myer in Arlington, Virginia. He had been drinking beer and, by his own later admission, had taken ephedrine, but something else drove him that night, something dark and inexplicable. Smirk later confessed that he had broken into Robin's house with the sole intention of killing someone. He said, "I knew that I was going to kill somebody. I did not know who I was going to kill. Something inside of me just compelled me to do it. It was like this overbearing thought in my brain that I needed to kill somebody." Though he claimed that he was familiar with the neighborhood because one of his friends also resided there, he had no clue who lived in Robin's home. He drove to West Springfield, to a neighborhood where he had partied with friends before. The house he chose was selected at random, a terrifying truth that would later send chills through the community. It could have been any house, any family, any life. Using a stick to jimmy open a sliding glass door, Smirk entered the home and went to Robin's bedroom. When she reached for the phone to call for help, he cut the cord. What followed was an attack of unimaginable brutality. Robin was stabbed 49 times. Smirk told detectives he used what he called his combat training during the assault. Robin begged him not to kill her. She tried to stop him, but her pleas went unanswered. After the murder, Smirk drove back to his barracks, tossing the knife off a bridge and throwing away his blood-stained clothes. Then he returned to his life as if nothing had happened, carrying a terrible secret that he would keep for nearly 30 years. Meanwhile, in that house on Resica Lane, a 2-year-old girl named Nicole was left alone with her mother's body. For 2 days, the toddler wandered through the house, confused and frightened, not understanding why her mother wouldn't wake up. When Ollie couldn't get in touch with Robin for a few days, he asked a family friend, Lori Lindbergh, to check on his wife and daughter. When Lori arrived at the house on the afternoon of November 20th, she found the back window open and the screen cut out. Entering the house, she saw a pool of blood in the bedroom. with little Nicole roaming around, confused. The child was dehydrated but physically unharmed, though the psychological scars of those 2 days would be impossible to measure. Lori immediately called 911 and took Nicole to the hospital for a checkup. When police arrived at the scene, they were confronted with what investigators would later describe as one of the most brutal crimes they had ever witnessed. Detective John Long would later say it was like your worst nightmare, adding that he is the boogeyman. Blood covered the bedroom walls. The violence had been extreme and personal, yet strangely there were valuables in the bedroom. Cash and jewelry, but nothing had been stolen. There was no sign of forced entry in the traditional sense. No evidence of sexual assault. This wasn't a robbery gone wrong. This was something else entirely. In those early days after Robin's murder, investigators worked tirelessly to find answers. They processed the crime scene meticulously, collecting fingerprints, blood samples, and DNA evidence. One piece of evidence in particular would prove crucial decades later: a washcloth found in Robin's bathroom that contained the killer's blood. Crime scene detective Mark Garman carefully preserved this evidence, not knowing that it would be why our killer is in custody 3 decades later, as Police Chief Kevin Davis would eventually say. The DNA profile was developed and run through CODIS, the FBI's national database. But there was no match. The killer wasn't in the system. As investigators pieced together a timeline, they naturally looked at those closest to Robin. They discovered that Ollie had been having an affair. Detectives flew down to the Bahamas to confirm his alibi, verifying that he was on the flight he was supposed to be on, and at the hotel where he claimed to be staying. They interviewed his lover but found no evidence of her involvement. Robin's family, her sister Mary, her brother Robert Jr., and her parents were shocked to learn about the affair, but they never believed Ollie was responsible for Robin's death. The evidence supported their instincts. Ollie's alibi was solid. The investigation expanded outward, examining Robin's social connections, her work relationships, anyone who might have had a reason to harm her, but every lead seemed to evaporate. Every theory led to a dead end. Days turned into weeks. Weeks turned into months. Months became years. The case went cold. For Robin's family, the years that followed were marked by a grief that never fully healed. Her father, Robert War Sr., a World War II veteran, would later recall the phone call telling him about Robin's death. One memory, he said, would never leave him. My granddaughter was right next to where she was murdered. I'll never forget that. Never. He had to break the devastating news to his surviving children. Mary War Cowens remembered that after hearing the words, "Robin is dead," her world shattered. It was like a nightmare. Her brother Robert Jr. added. At Robin's funeral, Mary remembered thinking, Robin's killer could be in this room with us. We didn't know. The uncertainty was almost as painful as the loss itself. Who had done this? Why? Would they ever know? Meanwhile, Stephen Smirk continued with his life. He left the army, moved to upstate New York, and settled in the quiet suburb of Niskayana. He married a defense attorney and had 2 children. He worked as a software engineer, living in a nice house in a good neighborhood. By all outward appearances, he was a model citizen, a family man with no criminal record, not even a speeding ticket. But beneath that ordinary surface, Smirk carried the weight of what he had done. Years later, he would tell detectives something chilling. I honestly believe that if it wasn't for my wife and my kids, I probably would be a serial killer. I am a serial killer who's only killed once. The statement was paradoxical and disturbing. Former FBI profiler Mary Ellen O'Toole noted that it is possible for someone with serial killer impulses to kill just once. We have learned over the years with cases like BTK and the Golden State Killer, and other cases where they do stop, she explained. The compulsions don't go away, but circumstances, family, fear of capture, or other factors can prevent them from acting on those impulses again. In 2019, 25 years after Robin's murder, the Fairfax County Police Department made a decision that would change everything. They sent the DNA sample from the crime scene to Parabon Nanolabs, a DNA technology company in Northern Virginia that specialized in genetic genealogy and DNA phenotyping. This was relatively new territory in forensic investigation. Genetic genealogy works by using a suspect's DNA to find their relatives who have submitted their DNA to genealogical databases. Investigators then research those relatives' family trees until they find a potential person of interest. Someone who would have been the right age and in the right place at the right time to commit the crime. But Robin's case presented unique challenges. The database matches were very distant, and Parabon gave the case a solvability rate of 0. Enter Liz, a volunteer with the Fairfax County Police Department, who asked that her last name not be used. Despite Parabon's pessimistic assessment, Liz decided to take on the challenge. The process proved difficult, and she was ready to give up a number of times. But Liz persisted. For 3.5 years, she worked through distant familial connections, constructing family trees, eliminating possibilities, following leads that went nowhere, and starting over again. The work was painstaking and frustrating, requiring patience, attention to detail, and an unwillingness to give up. Meanwhile, Detective Melissa Wallace and Detective John Long had been assigned to review Robin's cold case in April 2021. They were struck by the sheer violence of the attack. This wasn't just a murder, it was a frenzy. An explosion of violence that seemed to have no rational explanation. The detectives also requested that Parabon create a DNA phenotyping sketch, a composite image of what the killer might look like based solely on his DNA. The technology could predict physical appearance from genetic markers, skin color, facial structure, eye color, and other features. Scientists created a facial model showing a man with fair skin, a larger chin, and wider than average jaw and cheeks. Finally, after years of meticulous work, Liz had a name: Stefan Smirk. I felt like this really was him, Liz later said. I didn't know it for certain, but I believed it was. I contacted the detectives. When Detective Wallace received Liz's email suggesting Stefan Smirk as a person of interest, she immediately began looking into him. What she found seemed completely at odds with the profile of a brutal killer. Computer programmer up in New York, married to a defense attorney, 2 kids in high school, nice house in the suburbs. Not so much as a speeding ticket on his background, Wallace recalled. I'm thinking there's no way this is our guy. But then Detective Long found Smirk's yearbook photo from when he was 16 years old. It looked remarkably similar to the phenotyping sketch. The pieces were starting to align. The detectives learned that in November 1994, Smirk had been a 22-year-old soldier stationed at Fort Myer in Arlington, Virginia, just a short drive from where Robin was murdered. The timeline fit, the location fit, but they needed more. On September 7, 2023, Detectives Wallace and Long traveled to Niskayuna, New York, to pay Smirk a visit. They found him outside his home, placing trash bins at the end of his driveway, a mundane suburban task on what must have seemed like an ordinary day. The detectives approached him and identified themselves. All we said is we are detectives from Fairfax County, Virginia, and we're looking into a cold case from the 90s, Wallace recalled. Do you mind if we come in and talk to you? Smirk's response was unsettling in its calmness. He said, sure, you invited us in. Wallace continued. When they mentioned they were from Virginia investigating a murder, Smirk showed no reaction whatsoever. No reaction, none, Detective Long emphasized. Stone-faced. There was no surprise. The detectives asked if he would be willing to provide a DNA sample. Without hesitation, without requesting a lawyer, Smirk agreed. He allowed them to swab his cheek for DNA right there in his home. This level of cooperation was highly unusual, and it set off alarm bells for the experienced investigators. Chief Kevin Davis would later note that Smirk's willingness to cooperate was highly unusual. So that was a clue to our detectives that something may be afoot. The detectives thanked Smirk and left with the DNA sample, preparing to return to Virginia. They checked into a hotel, their minds racing with questions and possibilities. Then, just hours later, Smirk called Detective Wallace. I want to talk, and I want to talk right now, he told her. The adrenaline hit the detectives like a jolt of electricity. Wallace ran to Detective Long's hotel room, banging on his door. We gotta go to the police department, she told him. He's turning himself in. They advised Smirk to call 911 and go to the Niskayuna Police Department, which he did. By the time Wallace and Long arrived, local police had taken Smirk into custody. He was ready to talk. In the interrogation room at the Niskayuna Police Department, Stefan Smirk sat across from Detectives Wallace and Long. The man they had been hunting for nearly 30 years was finally in front of them, and he was ready to unburden himself of a secret he had carried since he was 22 years old. Without much prompting, Smirk began to confess. The detectives had to focus on making sure this was a sound interview that could potentially be used in court. Every word needed to be documented. every detail preserved. And Smirk told them about the night of November 18th, 1994. He had been at Fort Myer drinking beer and taking ephedrine. But it was something else, some dark compulsion that drove him out into the night. I knew that I was going to kill somebody, Smirk explained. I did not know who I was going to kill. Something inside of me just compelled me to do it. It was like this overbearing thought in my brain that I needed to kill somebody. He described driving to West Springfield, to a neighborhood he knew because friends lived there. He had no specific targets, no particular victim in mind. There could have been 50 people in that house. I don't know. They could have all had guns and shot me dead. I wasn't even thinking about that, he said. When prosecutor Kelsey Gill later described the crime in court, she noted that based on Smirk's confession, it wouldn't have mattered if there were 50 people in that house. He set out to kill someone. Smirk described breaking into the house, going to Robin's bedroom, cutting the phone cord when she tried to call for help. He described the stabbing in clinical terms, noting that he used his combat training. He described Robin begging for her life, trying to defend herself. Something came over me. Smirk told the detectives, I'm not going to say I heard voices in my head. I didn't hear somebody actually talking to me, but it was like this overbearing thought in my brain that I need to kill somebody. I just had to kill somebody. I can't explain it to you. After the murder, he said, he drove back to Fort Myer, disposing of the knife and his clothing along the way. Then he resumed his life, eventually leaving the military, getting married, having children, building a career, all while carrying the memory of what he had done. Then Smirk made one of the most disturbing statements of the entire interrogation. I honestly believe that if it wasn't for my wife and my kids, I probably would be a serial killer. I am a serial killer who's only killed once. The statement hung in the air. What did it mean? Was he truly a serial killer who had somehow managed to kill only once? Or was this a grandiose claim from someone trying to make sense of his own actions? When detectives asked if he had anything he wanted to say to Robin's family, Smirk's response was chilling in its lack of remorse. How do I say this? I know you're recording. I don't feel anything for the family. I feel bad that I did it because I knew someday my personal freedom would be affected. He wasn't sorry for what he had done to Robin. He wasn't sorry for the devastation he had caused her family, for the trauma inflicted on a 2-year-old girl, for the decades of pain and unanswered questions. He was only sorry that he had been caught. It was 100% intentional, Smirk stated flatly. The DNA sample that Smirk had voluntarily provided came back as a match to the evidence from the crime scene. Combined with his detailed confession, the case against him was overwhelming. In September 2023, Stephen Smirk was arrested and charged with murder. He waived extradition and was transported back to Virginia to face justice. When Ollie Lawrence, now living in France, received an email from a Fairfax County detective on a Friday morning, he could hardly believe it. After 29 years, police had a suspect in custody. The case that had haunted him and Robin's family for 3 decades was finally solved. At a preliminary hearing in April 2024, Robin's family saw Smirk for the first time. Lauren Ovens, Robin's niece, was struck by his size. I was amazed how big he was. He needed 2 bailiffs around him. The first thing I thought of was my aunt didn't stand a chance. Prosecutors played Smirk's confession for the court. The family heard in his own words what he had done to Robin. There was no emotion. Lauren recalled, it didn't feel real, just made me feel angry. How could he have done that? Fairfax County Commonwealth Attorney Steve Descano addressed the court with unusual candor. Look, I've dealt with murderers before. I can tell you that in my mind, Stephen Smirk stands alone as somebody who represents a true danger to the community. On October 4th, 2024, Stephen Smirk pleaded guilty to first-degree murder. On March 7th, 2025, Circuit Court Judge David Oblon sentenced Smirk to the maximum penalty, 70 years in prison, along with a $100,000 fine. The judge noted that he had almost rejected the plea agreement that prevented a life sentence. Mr. Smirk's cruel impact on the family he decimated is incalculable. Judge Oblon said, "This murder is one of the worst crimes in Fairfax County history. In the court's judgment, Smirk should receive the maximum sentence." At 53 years old, with health issues including diabetes and heart problems, the 70-year sentence effectively means Smirk will die in prison, due to a quirk of timing. The crime was committed 41 days before parole was abolished in Virginia. Smirk could technically be eligible for parole in 2037 when he would be 65 years old. However, if ever released, he would be required to wear a GPS monitor and undergo substance abuse and mental health treatment for the rest of his life. But given his age and health, it's unlikely he will ever see freedom again. For Robin's family, the arrest and conviction brought a complex mixture of emotions. There was relief that the killer had finally been caught, that justice had been served. But there was also renewed grief, as the case forced them to relive the horror of Robin's death in vivid detail. Mary Warcowens, Robin's sister, spoke at Smirk's sentencing. It helped to know that a person was found and being held responsible, but it didn't help to know what he did to Robin and how she suffered. It doesn't help, and it doesn't bring her back. In a statement after the sentencing, Mary reflected on what the resolution meant. We were pleased with the judge's determination and his offering a full 70-year sentencing. It brings some closure for me, and for the family we've waited 30 years to achieve. It doesn't change the facts of the case. It doesn't bring Robin back to us. It doesn't take away all the pain and suffering that we felt all of these years. But she also noted that closing this chapter allowed the family to move forward in a new way. Now that this part of the trial is finished, the sentencing is finished, it gives us an opportunity to kind of return to what we remember, not just about how she died, but who she was. And who was Robin Lawrence? She was a daughter of Syracuse, a graduate of Carnegie Mellon, an artist who won competitions at the Everson Museum as a child. She was a dancer who moved through life with grace and expression. She was a wife who built a life with Ollie in Virginia. She was a mother who loved her daughter Nicole with all her heart. She was a director of advertising who brought her creative vision to her work every day. She was a sister, a niece, a friend, someone who made others feel loved and helped them express themselves. Robin's father, Robert Warr Sr., now over 100 years old, lived to see his daughter's killer brought to justice. The family that had wondered for 30 years whether they would ever know the truth finally had their answers. Commonwealth Attorney Steve Descano summed up the significance of the case. The random and senseless murder of a young mother scarred Fairfax County for more than 30 years. The pain left by Robin Lawrence's murder can never fully heal. But I hope that today's sentence will help her loved ones finally close this difficult chapter. Robin Lawrence's case stands as a testament to the power of persistence in the pursuit of justice. It took the dedication of cold case detectives who refused to let the case fade away. It took the painstaking work of a volunteer genealogist who wouldn't give up, even when the experts said the case was unsolvable. It took advances in DNA technology that didn't exist in 1994. And it took the courage of a family that never stopped seeking answers. The case also highlights the randomness of violence and the terrifying reality that evil can wear an ordinary face. Stephen Smirk wasn't a monster lurking in the shadows. He was a soldier, a software engineer, a husband, a father. He lived a normal life for 30 years after committing an act of unspeakable brutality. The people who knew him had no idea what he had done. This duality, the capacity for extreme violence hidden beneath a veneer of normalcy, is perhaps the most unsettling aspect of the case. It reminds us that we can never truly know what darkness might reside in the hearts of those around us. But it also reminds us that justice, though sometimes delayed, can still prevail. That cold cases can be solved, that families can find closure, that the truth can come to light, even after decades of darkness. Tonight, as we remember Robin Lawrence, we remember not just how she died, but how she lived. We remember her art, her grace, her passion for dance, her dedication to her work, and her love for her daughter. We remember a woman whose life was full of promise and potential, cut short by an act of senseless violence. And we remember that even when all seems lost, even when the trail has gone cold, even when hope seems impossible, persistence, dedication, and advances in science can still bring the truth to light. Robin's story is one of tragedy, but also of perseverance, of loss, but also of love, of darkness, but ultimately of light breaking. Rest in peace, Robin Lawrence. Your family never forgot you. Justice finally found you. And your story, though marked by tragedy, will not be forgotten. Thank you for listening to tonight's true crime story. Rest peacefully knowing that another story awaits you next time, ready to accompany you on another journey toward restorative sleep. But if you're still awake, don't forget to like and subscribe so you don't miss our next true crime stories. And until next time, Stay safe and take care. Good night.